When we look at the birth of Christianity, we must understand that it did not arise in isolation or suddenly, but rather as the result of a very complex historical, political, social and spiritual context that marked the Roman Empire in the 1st century after Christ. Palestine, the region where it all began, was a province dominated by the Romans, subjected to heavy taxation, constant military vigilance, and a deep tension between Jewish traditions and the Greco-Roman culture that sought to impose itself. This environment, charged with dissatisfaction and messianic expectation, combined with centuries of oppression, became fertile ground for the emergence of a spiritual movement capable of spreading and forever changing the history of humanity. Following this timeline, we see that Jewish beliefs with their promise of a savior Messiah and Hellenistic philosophy, with its search for reason and the meaning of life, created a unique mixture that prepared society to receive a new and transformative message. In the midst of this context, Jesus of Nazareth is born, the central figure of the entire history of Christianity. Jesus grew up in a simple household, the son of a carpenter, learning from an early age the Jewish customs and the Hebrew scriptures. However, at the age of 30, his life changes radically when he begins a public ministry that lasts approximately 3 years. During this period, he travels through cities, villages, and deserts, preaching messages that quickly attract crowds. He speaks about love, forgiveness, repentance, justice, and a kingdom of God that is not based on armies or wealth. His teachings challenged both the Jewish religious authorities and the Roman imperial power, as they focused on inner and spiritual values, placing the individual and his conscience above rules and appearances. Miracles and signs attributed to him, such as healings, exorcisms, and even the resurrection of the dead, increased his popularity, but also intensified the persecution against him. The culminating point of Jesus' journey takes place in Jerusalem, when he is betrayed, arrested, and tried. Condemned to death by crucifixion under the government of Pontius Pilate, he dies like a common criminal, but his followers claim that on the 3rd day he rose again, appearing to them before ascending to heaven. This event, called the resurrection, is the heart of the Christian faith, for it initiates a movement that proclaims not just a doctrine or a moral code, but the promise of a new life. From this moment, the first Christian community is born, formed initially by his closest disciples known as apostles, and soon afterward by hundreds of new converts. After the death of Jesus, his followers begin to organize themselves. Gathering in small houses, they share their possessions, pray together, and spread the stories of the teacher they had known. It is in this period that figures like Peter and Paul stand out. Peter, considered by Catholic Christians as the first pope, assumes the spiritual leadership of the group in Jerusalem. Paul of Tarsus, formerly a persecutor of Christians, undergoes a radical transformation after a mystical experience on the road to Damascus and becomes the greatest preacher of nascent Christianity. Through his missionary journeys throughout the Greco-Roman world, he brings the Christian message beyond Jewish borders, opening it up to the Gentile peoples and making it a universal religion, not limited to one ethnicity or culture. His letters, addressed to different communities, would become an essential part of the New Testament. In its early years, Christianity is seen merely as another sect within Judaism. However, its ideas begin to differ radically. While Jewish law was based on rituals, traditions, and separation between pure and impure, the new faith taught that all were equal before God and that salvation was the result of grace, not works. This change generated internal and external conflicts, culminating in an ever greater distance between Jews and Christians. As the Christian communities grew, they spread throughout the entire territory of the Roman Empire, forming a complex and resilient network of organized groups that kept alive the memory of Jesus through meetings, preaching, and texts. The environment of the Roman Empire also played a crucial role in the expansion of this new faith. Latin and Greek served as common languages that allowed quick communication between different regions, while Roman roads facilitated the travel of missionaries. However, coexistence between nascent Christianity and the official Roman religion was not peaceful. The Romans looked with suspicion at a group that refused to worship the traditional gods and preached the existence of a single God above all, something considered dangerous for the political and religious stability of the empire. This refusal to participate in pagan ceremonies was interpreted as disloyalty, leading to a long period of persecutions and martyrdoms. The growth of Christianity in the first century after Christ is a phenomenon that even current historians find surprising. The simple and direct message about a God who loves everyone without distinction and who offers forgiveness and eternal life without financial or political demands attracted slaves, women, the poor, but also people of higher classes who were seeking a greater meaning in life. By the end of that first century, the foundations had been laid. Communities spread from Jerusalem to Rome, the first written Gospels and apostolic letters circulated, and a leadership emerged that, even under the threat of death, kept the faith united and alive. It was only the beginning of a story that would cross millennia and profoundly shape Western civilization. This block, therefore, presents the initial scenario of Christianity, highlighting its humble origin and its rapid growth within the Roman world. A story marked by faith, resistance, and the transformation of ordinary lives into protagonists of a movement that would change the history of humanity. After the first years of the Christian movement, the faith that had been born in a small region of the Roman Empire began to spread quietly, finding fertile ground in cities, villages, and distant regions. Early Christianity, which basically covers the first 3 centuries after Christ, was a period of formation and resistance, during which the followers of Jesus lived under the constant threat of persecution, but also consolidated practices, traditions, and structures that would give rise to the organized church. This was a time of severe trials, marked by cruel martyrdoms, and by the firmness of a faith that spread more through the power of example than through any structures of power. At the beginning, Christianity was seen by the Romans merely as a Jewish sect, one more among the many religious expressions of that era. However, the refusal of Christians to worship the traditional gods of Rome, their firm defense of the existence of a single God, and their practice of communal life generated distrust. For the Romans, religion was an element of political cohesion. Participation in public rituals was a sign of loyalty to the empire. When Christians refused to burn incense to the emperor, this was interpreted as an act of rebellion. Thus, little by little, tensions increased, and the authorities began to persecute those accused of subverting social order and challenging the stability of Rome. In the first 2 centuries, persecutions were local and sporadic. In some cities, governors ignored Christians. In others, they imposed severe penalties. However, at the end of the first century, especially after the Great Fire of Rome in the year 64 after Christ, the Emperor Nero inaugurated one of the most cruel persecutions. Accusing Christians of having set fire to the city, he ordered mass arrests, public executions, and brutal spectacles in which Christians were devoured by beasts or burned alive as a public warning. This episode, widely recorded by ancient authors, marks the first large-scale official persecution, but it would not be the last. From the 2nd century onward, hostility toward Christians became more organized. Many Roman intellectuals and citizens viewed the new faith with disdain, calling Christians atheists for rejecting the traditional gods and accusing them of obscure rituals. Rumors arose about strange practices, such as cannibalism, a distortion of the Eucharist rite, with claims that they ate human flesh during the sharing of bread and wine, symbols of the body and blood of Christ. In this environment, living as a Christian required unusual courage. It meant risking one's life at every celebration and with every public declaration of faith. Even in the face of persecutions, early Christianity grew. This growth was driven by several factors. First, the Christian message offered hope to the marginalized. The poor, orphans, widows, and slaves found in Christianity a place of refuge and equality. Second, the network of communities, formed by small domestic groups, allowed a flexible and discreet organization, capable of quickly adapting to changes and threats. Third, persecution itself strengthened the faith. By seeing brothers and sisters give their lives without denying their belief, many were moved and converted. The martyrs, far from destroying Christianity, strengthened it and inspired others to follow the same path. It is also during this period that the texts that make up the New Testament begin to take form. Gospels, letters, and accounts circulated among the communities, copied by hand and carefully preserved. Although there was not yet a closed canon, these writings served as a guide and reference, giving unity to the various churches spread throughout the empire. Gradually, the role of bishops became important. Each community came to have a leader responsible for teaching doctrine, celebrating rites, and protecting the faith from distortions. From this core, the basis of the hierarchy that would later form the institutional church arose. As the Christian faith grew, heresies and divergent interpretations also appeared. To combat them, communities began to gather in local councils and exchange letters to maintain unity. This collective effort led to the first clearer theological formulations, such as the understanding of the Trinity, the divinity of Christ, and the nature of his mission. Even though these issues were the subject of intense debates, they helped to mature the faith and establish a solid core of essential doctrines. In the 3rd century, persecutions reached even harsher levels. Emperors such as Decius and Diocletian tried to eradicate Christianity with systematic measures: the destruction of places of worship, confiscation of property, demands for certificates of sacrifice to the gods, and the execution of those who refused. This period became known as the Great Persecution. However, not even organized violence managed to extinguish the flame of this faith. The Roman catacombs became places of refuge and worship, and at the same time cemeteries that preserved the memory of the martyrs, figures revered as supreme examples of faithfulness. Another fundamental element of early Christianity was charity. While Roman society was marked by inequality and the abandonment of the weakest, Christians stood out for caring for the sick, feeding the hungry, and helping those in need. This behavior aroused curiosity and admiration, gaining sympathizers even among those who did not share the faith. Solidarity became a powerful testimony, and this created a striking contrast between the Christian community and the coldness of the surrounding world. By the end of the 3rd century, Christianity was no longer a small movement. Despite persecution, it had become a solid network of communities linked by faith and by texts that circulated widely. The seeds of an irreversible transformation had been planted. Soon the Roman Empire would witness something unthinkable, an emperor embracing this faith and, from then on, changing the destiny of a religion that until then had been considered an enemy. This would mark the next great step, when Christianity would leave the shadows of secrecy and move toward becoming the dominant religion of the Western world. At the beginning of the 4th century after Christ, the history of Christianity underwent a profound and definitive transformation that would forever alter the destiny of the Christian faith and at the same time the very structure of the Roman Empire. For more than 200 years, the followers of Jesus had lived under the constant threat of persecution. Many were imprisoned, tortured, expelled from their lands and killed for refusing to worship pagan gods or to recognize the emperor as divine. However, the scenario that seemed unchangeable began to shift with the rise of a decisive figure, Flavius Valerius Constantinus, later known as Constantine the Great. The life of this man and the document known as the Edict of Milan would become a turning point in the relationship between religion and politics, between church and empire, placing Christianity at the very center of power. Constantine was born in the year 272 after Christ, the son of a Roman army officer, and Helena, a woman of humble origin who would later be venerated as a saint by Christian tradition. His youth was marked by solid military training and by living close to the backstage of power, but also by the political complexity of a fragmented empire. At that moment, Rome no longer had a strong centralized government. Power was divided among several emperors and Augusti in a system called the Tetrarchy. This political instability generated constant conflicts, civil wars, and disputes for the throne, a context in which Constantine would rise to power. In 306 after Christ, after the death of his father, Constantine was proclaimed emperor by the troops in Britannia. However, his authority was contested by other rulers, and a long struggle for supremacy began. During these years of war, Constantine shaped his image as a firm leader and brilliant strategist, gaining the support of different sectors of the army and consolidating important alliances. The most decisive moment of his life would come in 312 after Christ, in the famous Battle of the Milvian Bridge, near Rome. There he would face his rival Maxentius in a battle that would be recorded both in history books and in Christian tradition for a remarkable event. According to the account preserved by historians such as Eusebius of Caesarea and Lactantius, on the eve of the battle, Constantine is said to have had a mysterious vision. He saw in the sky a luminous symbol, a kind of cross accompanied by the words, "By this sign you will conquer." Impressed, he ordered that this symbol be painted on the shields of his soldiers. The next day, he faced Maxentius and achieved a crushing victory, being acclaimed as the sole ruler of the West. This episode would be interpreted as a divine sign and would forever mark the relationship between Constantine and Christianity, although his full conversion was a gradual process that is still debated by scholars today. With victory secured, Constantine adopted a new stance toward Christianity. Unlike his predecessors who sought to destroy the Christian faith, he saw in this religion a force capable of unifying a divided empire. In 313 after Christ, together with Licinius, emperor of the East, Constantine issued the famous Edict of Milan. This decree did not immediately make Christianity the official religion of the empire, as many imagine, but it granted something equally revolutionary: religious freedom. From that moment, all citizens of the empire were allowed to worship their deities freely, without punishment or persecution. For Christians, this decision marked the end of centuries of secrecy and martyrdom, allowing them to live their faith in peace. The Edict of Milan also provided for the return of property confiscated from Christian communities during earlier persecutions. Destroyed churches were rebuilt, properties were returned, and for the first time Christianity could be expressed publicly. This change of status not only brought peace to the faithful, but also gave the church conditions to organize itself in a more structured way, founding larger centers of worship, schools, and places of social assistance. Imperial support allowed for unprecedented expansion. In the years that followed, the relationship between Constantine and Christianity grew even closer. He began to favor the church with resources, donations, and privileges, summoning religious leaders to advise him on political and spiritual matters. However, the new freedom also brought new challenges. Without the common enemy of persecution, internal disagreements among Christians began to emerge more clearly. Different interpretations of the nature of Christ and of the Trinity gave rise to intense debates that threatened the newly won unity. Faced with these disputes, in 325, after Christ, Constantine decided to convene the first ecumenical council in the history of the Church, the Council of Nicaea. This meeting of bishops and leaders from different regions sought to resolve fundamental issues of the Christian faith and to establish a clear and unified doctrine. The result of this gathering was the formulation of the Nicene Creed, a summary of the central beliefs of Christianity that remains to this day as a milestone of Christian theology. The direct participation of the emperor in this council shows how the relationship between political power and religion became increasingly close. As the years passed, Constantine also took practical measures that demonstrated his favorable inclination toward Christianity. He ordered the construction of grand basilicas, such as St. Peter's Basilica in Rome and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. His mother, Helena, traveled to the Holy Land, where, according to tradition, she discovered the true cross of Christ. All of this contributed to consolidating the symbolic and material importance of Christian faith at the heart of the empire. However, it is important to note that Christianity was still not the sole official religion. During his reign, Constantine maintained a relatively tolerant stance toward pagan beliefs, although he gradually gave more space and privileges to the church. His own conversion only occurred officially shortly before his death in 337 after Christ, when he was baptized. There are historical debates about the sincerity or the exact moment of this conversion, but regardless, the impact of his policies is undeniable. He transformed a persecuted religion into a faith respected and supported by the state. Thus, with Constantine and the Edict of Milan, Christianity ceased to be a marginalized sect and became a central factor in the life of the empire. The way was opened for this religion, within a few decades, to become official and to profoundly shape Western civilization. This period marks the beginning of the transition from a clandestine Christianity to an imperial Christianity, with all the cultural, political, and spiritual consequences that this change would bring in the centuries to come. By the time we reach the 4th century after Christ, the situation of Christianity had changed radically compared to the first 3 centuries. Open persecution had ceased with the Edict of Milan. Imperial support now gave the Christian faith a security it had never experienced before, and churches could build temples, hold public ceremonies, and expand their influence over increasingly vast regions. But this growth also brought to light an inevitable reality. the diversity of theological interpretations and doctrines that, while hidden under the threat of persecutions, now became visible and dangerously conflicting. It became necessary to clearly define what united Christians, and for that purpose, one of the most remarkable meetings in the history of the Church took place, the Council of Nicaea, convened in 325 after Christ. The context of this council was born out of a serious theological controversy that threatened to divide the Christian community. This dispute was triggered by the presbyter Arius of Alexandria, who began teaching that Jesus Christ, although great and essential for salvation, was not eternal like the Father, but a creature created before time itself. For Arius, Christ was the most perfect being created by God, but he did not share the same divine essence as the Father. This idea, known as Arianism, quickly gained followers because it offered an apparently simple logic to explain the relationship between God the Father and Jesus Christ. However, it also raised serious questions. If Christ was not fully divine, how could he offer eternal salvation? If he was only a creature, even the most perfect one, his work could not be sufficient to reconcile humanity with God. The crisis caused by Arianism was so intense that it spread throughout the empire, reaching not only religious circles, but also causing public turmoil. The Emperor Constantine, newly converted to Christianity, realized that this division could threaten the unity of the empire, since religion now played a central role in the social and political fabric. To resolve the issue, he made an unprecedented decision: to summon all bishops and leaders of the church to an assembly of never-before-seen dimensions. The chosen location was the city of Nicaea, in the region of Bithynia, near Constantinople. According to ancient records, the council gathered around 300 bishops from different parts of the empire, from Syria to Hispania. It was the first time that the church, spread over so many regions, officially came together in an ecumenical, that is, universal, event to seek a clear definition of the Christian faith. The presence of the emperor himself at the opening of the assembly shows the political importance of this meeting, even though he declared that his role would be only as mediator and not as theologian. The debates were intense and lasted for weeks. Bishops who defended the full divinity of Christ, such as Athanasius of Alexandria, argued that Jesus was consubstantial with the Father, meaning he possessed the same divine essence. This position affirmed that Jesus was not created, but generated from all eternity, being equally God. On the other hand, the followers of Arius argued that the Son was inferior to the Father, and that there was a time when he did not exist. This divergence was not just an abstract philosophical matter, it had deep implications for the faith and practice of Christians. In the end, the position defended by Athanasius prevailed. The council officially rejected Arianism as heresy and formulated a document that would become a milestone, the Nicene Creed. This text clearly established the Christian faith, declaring that Jesus Christ is God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, consubstantial with the Father. With these words, the Church defined that Jesus is not a creature, but God himself, eternal and equal to the Father. This declaration became a cornerstone of Christianity and remains to this day in Catholic, Orthodox, and many Protestant liturgies. The Council of Nicaea also addressed other important issues. A common date was established for the celebration of Easter, resolving regional disputes about the calendar. Ecclesiastical discipline was discussed, including the conduct of the clergy and rules for Christian communities. In addition, practical decisions were made to improve unity among the churches spread throughout the empire. It is significant to note that the Council of Nicaea marked a new era, the era of ecumenical councils. From that moment on, whenever major theological controversies arose, the Church would turn to these universal gatherings to discern and formulate its doctrine. The emperor himself, although not deciding matters of faith, played an essential role in ensuring that these meetings took place and that the decisions were implemented. The consequences of the council were profound. The dogmatic definition proclaimed there consolidated the theological foundation of Christianity and strengthened the authority structure of the Church. On the other hand, Arianism did not disappear immediately. It continued to exist for decades, especially among the Germanic peoples. Nevertheless, the impact of the Nicene Creed was so great that the Christian faith gained a doctrinal unity fundamental to face future challenges. After the council, Christianity entered a period of more solid organization. The faith that had once been clandestine and fragmented became a religion with firm and widely accepted doctrinal principles. This allowed the Church, in a short time, to assume an even more relevant role in the empire, influencing political, educational, and cultural decisions. At the same time, Christianity ceased to be a movement based solely on experience and began to have a robust theological body capable of addressing the great intellectual issues of the time. Thus, the Council of Nicaea not only responded to an urgent theological controversy, but also paved the way for a new phase in the history of Christianity, in which faith and reason would walk together under the supervision of a church increasingly centralized and linked to imperial power. With the end of persecutions and the consolidation of religious freedom after the Edict of Milan and the Council of Nicaea, Christianity entered a new phase in its history, ceasing to be merely a movement of resistance and becoming a structured and influential institution at the heart of the Roman Empire. The Church began to organize itself in a far more visible way, acquiring buildings, functions, and authority, creating positions, rules, and methods of governance that, over the following centuries, would become a model of religious hierarchy capable of surviving political changes, invasions, and social transformations. It was in this moment that the Catholic Church began to form the administrative and spiritual identity that we know to this day. In the early times, Christian communities were simple and decentralized. Each city had a group of believers who gathered in private houses, led by presbyters, elders who were responsible for doctrine and charity. With the growth of faith and the freedom that had been achieved, the need arose for a more defined structure. Gradually, a clear hierarchical order was established. At the center of this organization were the bishops, who assumed the role of guiding a city and its smaller churches. Below the bishops were the presbyters and deacons, responsible for assisting in the celebration of the sacraments, preaching, and works of service. This form of organization guaranteed discipline, clarity, and a secure point of reference for Christians who multiplied in different regions. Among all the episcopal sees, some gained prominence due to their historical and political importance. Cities such as Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and most importantly Rome, became centers of great authority. Rome, in particular, began to exercise a unique role. Because it had been the capital of the empire and preserved the tradition of the apostles Peter and Paul, Rome was gradually recognized as the main seat, and its bishop came to be regarded as the highest spiritual authority, receiving the title of Pope. This centralization in the figure of the Bishop of Rome did not happen overnight, but was the result of a long process in which the other bishops increasingly appealed to the Bishop of Rome to resolve disputes and confirm decisions. In addition to hierarchy, the Church began to develop symbols, liturgies, and traditions of its own. Christian worship ceased to be held only in homes and began to be celebrated in buildings called basilicas, many of them built with the direct support of Emperor Constantine. These constructions were large, with imposing columns, altars, spaces for the faithful, and a special area for the bishops. The Eucharistic celebration became more organized and solemn, with defined rites and prayers, hymns, and a liturgical order that gave a visible form to the faith. At the same time, specific vestments for the clergy began to appear, symbols such as the cross, the fish, and the chrism, and liturgical feasts that commemorated important moments in the life of Jesus and the apostles. Another fundamental element of this phase was the strengthening of monasticism. Inspired by men and women who abandoned everything to live in the desert, devoted to prayer and penance, the first monasteries appeared, communities that sought to live in simplicity, discipline, and work. These monks and nuns played a decisive role in the spiritual organization of the Church, for in addition to their life of devotion, they became centers of preservation of knowledge, copying books, studying the scriptures, and offering hospitality to travelers and the poor. In the future, monastic orders would become true cultural and spiritual pillars of the Middle Ages. With freedom, the Church also began to participate more actively in social life. Institutions of charity, hospitals, and shelters for widows and orphans were created. Bishops came to act as mediators in conflicts, advisors to rulers and protectors of the weak. This social function increased the credibility of the Church and brought it even closer to the population, who saw in it a safe haven in times of crisis. Gradually, Christians went from being persecuted to figures of prominence in the administration of the empire itself. The structuring of the church also involved the organization of texts and doctrines. It was during this period that the canon of the Christian scriptures was consolidated, defining which books would be recognized as inspired by God and accepted in the New Testament. Regional councils confirmed the list of gospels, letters, and other writings, giving unity to teaching. In addition, catechisms, instructions, and manuals began to be written to guide new converts. The education of the faithful became a priority, with the aim of forming a solid community, aware of its faith and prepared to respond to the heresies that still arose. With this consolidation, the church became a true network of interconnected communities, crossing borders and language barriers. There was a growing awareness that it was not just a local group, but a universal church, Catholic, that united different peoples under the same faith. This notion of unity, reinforced by the central role of Rome, helped the church remain firm even when, centuries later, the empire collapsed under barbarian attacks. Another fundamental aspect that emerged at this time was canon law, that is, a set of rules and laws proper to the church. These rules dealt with the life of the faithful, the behavior of the clergy, the administration of property, and the resolution of internal conflicts. Over time, this body of law would become very complex and influential, serving as a foundation for civil legal systems in several countries. Thus, the period of structuring of the Catholic Church is marked by a definitive transition. The faith that had been born among fishermen and craftsmen of Galilee now became a robust, organized institution present throughout the Roman Empire. By adopting a clear form of government, rules, and rights, the Church laid the foundations for its survival in the centuries to come. And even though, in the future, it would face internal divisions and deep crises, this structure allowed the Church to maintain its continuity and its identity for almost 2 millennia. When Christianity ceased to be a persecuted religion and began to enjoy freedom and recognition within the Roman Empire, a process began that would profoundly transform the balance between religion and politics. In the 4th century after Christ, the Church not only gained respect, but became a parallel power within the empire itself. As the centuries advanced, this influence grew to the point where the Catholic Church became an indispensable element for the stability of the Roman world, shaping political decisions, mediating disputes, and occupying roles that had once belonged exclusively to imperial authorities. This period was marked by a silent but decisive transition in which the Church stopped being only a community of believers and became an institution with authority, resources, and responsibilities that extended beyond the spiritual sphere. The first factor that consolidated this power was the explicit alliance between Emperor Constantine and the Christian leaders. After the Edict of Milan, the Church began to receive property, privileges, and financial support. Monumental basilicas were built in Rome, Constantinople, Jerusalem, and other cities, creating sacred spaces that also served as centers of political decision-making. The moral authority of the bishops grew to such an extent that many citizens turned to them as arbiters in civil disputes. This happened because Christians saw in the bishop an impartial figure guided by spiritual values, rather than just a state official. During the reign of Theodosius, at the end of the 4th century after Christ, a definitive milestone occurred. Christianity ceased to be just a tolerated religion and became the official religion of the Roman Empire. The Edict of Thessalonica, promulgated in 380 after Christ, established that all subjects of the empire were to profess the Nicene Christian faith. With this, Christianity gained a unique status, being protected by law and receiving privileges that no other religion possessed. From that moment, pagan cults began to be discouraged, ancient temples were closed, and the authority of the Church became inseparably intertwined with that of the state. This union between Church and empire brought benefits, but also challenges. The Church now had access to resources and means to expand its mission, but at the same time it had to deal with the temptation of power. Bishops began to participate in councils of government, to intervene in legal decisions, and even to influence the selection of emperors. On the other hand, emperors, aware of the Church's moral strength, sought support and legitimacy from the Pope and bishops, creating a complex relationship of mutual dependence. Another essential point for understanding the power of the Church during this period is the social role it assumed. In an unstable world marked by wars, famine, and economic crises, the church became a refuge for the poor. Hospitals, shelters, and charitable works multiplied under its direction. This social assistance strengthened the bond between the people and the religious leaders, while the state, often absent, saw its own authority complemented by the presence of the church. Christian morality, with its defense of compassion and justice, helped create a sense of order and cohesion amid the difficulties of the empire. The consolidation of this power was also reflected in the internal organization of the church. Positions and functions were clearly defined, and the figure of the Pope in Rome began to stand out more and more as a symbol of unity. The Pope was not only a spiritual leader, he also represented the voice of the church before the emperor, capable of interceding on behalf of Christian communities and, in some cases, challenging decisions that contradicted the principles of faith. This position, which was still in development, would become crucial after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, when the church would inherit part of the political responsibilities that once belonged to the rulers. As the empire became Christianized, pagan rites were gradually replaced by Christian practices. Many ancient festivals were adapted, and classical symbols were reinterpreted from a Christian perspective. Art, architecture, and even legislation began to reflect the new spiritual reality that dominated Rome. Christian values began to influence the formulation of laws, especially in areas such as marriage, family, and the protection of the weak. This fusion of faith and politics gave rise to what we call Christendom, a concept that would become the foundation of European civilization throughout the Middle Ages. An emblematic example of this new power occurred when Emperor Theodosius, after the massacre of Thessalonica, was publicly reprimanded by Bishop Ambrose of Milan. Ambrose refused to allow the emperor to participate in the Eucharist until he repented of his violent action. This attitude showed, in an unprecedented way, that not even the emperor was above the moral demands of the church. It was a clear sign that spiritual power was beginning to impose limits on political power. Therefore, the church as a power within the Roman Empire was not limited to being a religious institution. It became an essential part of governance and the functioning of the empire. While it evangelized, taught, and cared for the needy, the church also became a moral and administrative power, forging a partnership with the state that would forever transform the history of Europe. This position of prominence, achieved at the end of the Roman Empire, would be the foundation for the central role it would assume after the collapse of the West, when bishops and the Pope would become leaders in a world devastated by the absence of imperial authority. The 5th century after Christ marked a dramatic turning point in the history of the West. The powerful Western Roman Empire, which for centuries had guaranteed political order, a stable economy, and a complex network of cities and roads, collapsed under a devastating sequence of barbarian invasions, internal crises, and social instability. Amid this scenario of ruin, famine, and fear, the Catholic Church, which until then had been a partner of the state, became the only institution capable of keeping some form of cohesion and continuity alive. When Rome fell, it was not just a city that collapsed. An entire system of civilized life crumbled, and in this vacuum, the Church assumed a role that no other power was able to play, the role of guardian of the culture, knowledge, and historical memory of Europe. The causes of the fall of the empire are multiple. For decades, Roman borders were attacked by different peoples: Visigoths, Vandals, Huns, Franks, Ostrogoths, Lombards. These groups, generically called barbarians by the Romans, sought land, security, and wealth, and relentlessly pressed the defenses of the empire. At the same time, internal crisis weakened Rome. The economy was fragile, corruption eroded public administration, political struggles weakened the armies, and the central authority was no longer able to react efficiently. In the year 410 after Christ, Rome was sacked by the Visigoths, an event that caused a profound psychological shock throughout the Roman world. In 455, it was the Vandals who invaded the city, bringing even more destruction. Finally, in 476 after Christ, the last Western Roman emperor Romulus Augustulus was deposed, and imperial authority in the West disappeared. With the collapse of Roman institutions, Western Europe plunged into a period of chaos and fragmentation. Cities lost their importance, roads were abandoned, the economy reverted to dependence on local agriculture, and the population was left at the mercy of tribal leaders. In this context, The Catholic Church, already well-structured and with a defined hierarchical system, became the only organization with presence in all regions, capable of providing some sense of continuity. While the political world collapsed, the bishops and monks remained. The Pope in Rome, even without armies or military power, became a central figure, respected even by barbarian leaders, as he represented an ancient and stable institution. One of the most significant roles of the Church during this period was the preservation of knowledge. In monasteries, copyist monks devoted their lives to the patient and silent task of copying ancient books, both religious and philosophical or scientific. Thanks to this work, the writings of classical authors such as Cicero, Virgil, Aristotle, and Plato were saved from destruction and transmitted to posterity. These monasteries became true centers of light in a dark age, preserving not only manuscripts, but also agricultural techniques, artisanal skills, and artistic traditions that would otherwise have been lost. In addition to preserving texts, the Church took responsibility for education. The few centers of study that continued to exist after the fall of Rome were under its protection. Monasteries and cathedrals hosted schools where young people learned to read, write, and study the scriptures, ensuring that knowledge would not completely disappear. In this way, Latin, the language of the Church, continued to serve as the thread that united regions that otherwise would have been completely isolated from one another. Another important aspect was the evangelization of the barbarian peoples. With the disappearance of the Roman government, bishops began to engage with the new lords of the land, kings and tribal chiefs, offering not only spiritual guidance, but also administrative knowledge. Many of these peoples eventually converted to Christianity, first to Arianism and later to Catholicism, creating bonds that gradually helped rebuild some form of order. The conversion of Clovis, king of the Franks, to Catholicism at the end of the 5th century, after Christ, is an example of how the Church knew how to adapt and gain influence in this new world in transformation. The social function of the Church also expanded immensely. Without a state capable of providing security and assistance, it was the bishops who organized aid for the poor, built shelters for widows and orphans, and created rudimentary hospitals to care for the sick. In ruined cities, the bishop became the reference point of authority. They were consulted to resolve disputes, manage resources, and negotiate with invading peoples. In many cases, it was the bishops, not the soldiers, who negotiated the survival of the populations in the face of a barbarian siege. At the same time, the Pope began to gain increasing importance. Rome, even in ruins, was seen as the spiritual seat of Western Christianity. The Bishop of Rome came to represent a point of unity, and as centuries passed, would become the most important voice in religious and political matters. The Church, by presenting itself as the guardian of Roman values and cultural legacy, managed to keep alive the memory of ancient greatness, preparing the ground for the cultural rebirth that would take place many centuries later. Thus, in the period following the fall of the Roman Empire, the Catholic Church assumed a fundamental role. It preserved books and knowledge, provided social assistance, maintained the Latin language, protected the memory of Roman law, and offered leadership in a time when politics and institutions had disappeared. While the world around it collapsed, the Church became the bridge between antiquity and the Middle Ages. And this role as guardian of culture would make it, from that moment on, the greatest organizing force of medieval Europe, a beacon amid the darkness left by the fall of Rome. With the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 after Christ and the consequent political fragmentation of Europe, the Catholic Church emerged as the only institution capable of offering stability, order, and continuity in a disorganized world immersed in a long period of transition. Over the following centuries, this institution grew not only in spiritual power, but also in political, economic, and cultural influence, to the point of becoming the most powerful and ever-present force throughout the Middle Ages. This period, which extends approximately from the 5th to the 15th century, is marked by an almost inseparable fusion between faith and power, in which the Pope and the bishops assumed roles that went far beyond the religious sphere. Immediately after the fall of Rome, Western Europe entered a state of ruralization and fragmentation. The former urban centers were abandoned or drastically reduced, and populations began living in small communities under the protection of local lords and warrior chiefs. In this reality, without unified laws or centralized armies, The church was the only link between regions and the only source of stable authority. Cathedrals, monasteries, and churches became the main centers of social organization. The Pope in Rome became the symbol of a spiritual unity that gradually began to influence political structures as well. During the early Middle Ages, the Christianization of the barbarian peoples was one of the Church's priorities. Monks and missionaries traveled across vast regions, converting Germanic, Celtic, and Slavic tribes. This expansion was not merely spiritual, it also created new bonds of dependence between newly converted kings and the Pope, forging alliances that further strengthened papal power. The conversion of Clovis, king of the Franks, in the late 5th century, and later the coronation of Charlemagne by the Pope in 800 after Christ as Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, symbolized this pact between religious power and political power. The act of coronation made it clear that an emperor's authority depended on the blessing of the Church, inaugurating a tradition that would define the entire Middle Ages. As the centuries passed, the Church accumulated wealth and lands, becoming the largest landowner in Europe. Monasteries and cathedrals received donations, tithes, and inheritances, and this wealth was used both to sustain charitable works and to support political influence. In return for this material wealth, the Church offered spiritual protection and mediation between nobles and the people. No important decision, whether in war or peace, was made without the participation of bishops and abbots, who served as advisors to kings and feudal lords. In some cases, bishops themselves became direct rulers of territories, combining spiritual power with temporal authority. The Pope, at the center of this structure, gradually took on an increasingly absolute role. The papal figure became a kind of supreme arbiter of Christendom, able to intervene in conflicts between kingdoms and even to depose monarchs. Popes such as Gregory VII in the 11th century challenged powerful kings and imposed spiritual authority above crowns. The episode of the investiture controversy, when the Pope clashed with Emperor Henry IV over who had the power to appoint bishops, is a classic example of this conflict. When Henry IV was forced to go to Canossa in 1077 after Christ to ask the Pope for forgiveness, the medieval world understood that above the power of weapons stood the power of the Church. Another essential factor in the strengthening of the Church was monasticism. Throughout the Middle Ages, monastic orders multiplied, particularly the Benedictines, Cistercians, Carthusians, and later the Franciscans and Dominicans. These monks not only devoted themselves to prayer and contemplation, but also worked in education, book copying, agriculture, and the care of the poor and sick. The monasteries became true centers of civilization in the midst of a ruralized and hostile world. Without them, much of the cultural and intellectual heritage of antiquity would have been lost. This silent preservation of knowledge ensured that Europe did not fall completely into darkness. In the cultural field, the influence of the Church was absolute. All education was conducted in institutions linked to bishoprics or monasteries. Medieval philosophy, called scholasticism, was born and developed within this environment, seeking to reconcile Christian faith with the reason inherited from Greek philosophers. Monumental works, such as those of Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, were born from this effort. The Church was also the greatest patron of the arts. Churches and Gothic cathedrals, with their stained glass and sculptures, represent the synthesis of spirituality and aesthetics in the Middle Ages. Liturgy and daily life also came under the strong influence of the Church. From birth to death, the events of a person's life were marked by rituals and sacraments: baptism, marriage, confession, Eucharist, extreme unction. Religious festivals defined the calendar and the cycles of work and rest. Christian morality shaped laws and customs, and any act of rebellion against this order was considered not only a civil crime, but also a sin. However, this absolute power was not free from criticism and abuse. With so much wealth and influence, there were also episodes of corruption, internal disputes, and political ambition. Bishops and abbots, in some cases, sought more power and prestige than spiritual service. These failures would later become one of the main causes of the reform movements that shook the Church. But during the Middle Ages, the Church managed to consolidate itself as the backbone of European society, ensuring not only the survival of faith, but also the continuity of culture. Therefore, throughout the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church ceased to be merely a religion and became the most powerful institution in the Western world. Its authority extended from the throne to the countryside, from schools to courts, from armies to villages. This absolute power created a profound legacy that still shapes the foundations of European culture and paved the way for religion to become the center of the great political and intellectual transformations of the continent in the centuries to come. As the Middle Ages progressed and the Catholic Church consolidated its political and spiritual power, an essential phenomenon for the formation of the medieval world began to expand and reshape the European landscape: the rise and multiplication of monastic orders. Monasticism, which in its beginnings had been merely an individual choice of men and women who sought to withdraw from the world and live in penance in the desert, evolved into one of the most powerful organizing forces of medieval society. These religious communities created a new model of Christian life based on prayer, work, and study, playing a central role in the preservation of culture, evangelization, and the strengthening of the Church's influence throughout Europe. The origin of this movement is linked to the Desert Fathers, men and women who in the 3rd and 4th centuries after Christ withdrew to isolated regions of Egypt, Syria, and Palestine, fleeing from the corruption and moral decadence of the cities. They sought a life of deep prayer, silence, and penance. These hermits, by renouncing all material comfort, inspired others to follow the same path. Over time, these individual experiences gave rise to organized communities, where solitary life was replaced by communal life under clear rules. Thus emerged cenobitic monasticism, in which monks and nuns lived together under strict discipline, guided by a spiritual superior. The great landmark of the institutionalization of monastic life in the West was the rule of Saint Benedict, created at the beginning of the 6th century after Christ. Benedict of Nursia, considered the father of Western monasticism, founded the famous Abbey of Monte Cassino in Italy and wrote a set of norms that balanced prayer, manual labor, and study. The rule of Saint Benedict became the model for virtually all subsequent monastic orders. It emphasized community life, silence, humility, obedience, and hospitality, creating a way of life that would completely transform the religious landscape of the Middle Ages. For centuries, the Benedictine monks were the great guardians of knowledge and spirituality. Benedictine monasteries became centers of civilization. In their libraries, copyist monks dedicated years to reproducing by hand books of the Bible, the Church Fathers, and even classical works from Greece and Rome, ensuring that this knowledge would not be lost in an age marked by invasions and destruction. Their scriptoria produced richly illuminated manuscripts, true works of art that have survived to the present day. At the same time, the monks also played a practical role in rural life, teaching agricultural techniques, swamp drainage, construction, and livestock raising. In many regions devastated by wars and urban decline, monasteries became the only point of stability and progress. As the centuries passed, new orders emerged to respond to the needs of the time. In the 11th century after Christ, for example, the Cistercian order appeared, founded by monks who sought to return to the original simplicity of the rule of Saint Benedict, avoiding the excess wealth that some monasteries had accumulated. The Cistercians, known for their austere life and hard work, transformed entire regions of Europe into fertile lands, introducing new agricultural techniques. In the same period appeared the Carthusians, who combined community life with periods of isolation, seeking a balance between contemplation and strict discipline. In the 12th and 13th centuries, in a context of growing cities and social transformations, came the so-called mendicant orders, such as the Franciscans and Dominicans. Unlike traditional monks, who lived isolated in the countryside, the friars of these new orders chose to live among the people, preaching, teaching, and helping those in need. Francis of Assisi, founder of the Order of Friars Minor, revolutionized the concept of religious life by embracing radical poverty, preaching in the streets, and seeking to imitate the simplicity and humility of Christ. The Dominicans, on the other hand, focused on preaching and combating heresies, becoming masters of theology and responsible for the creation of universities. These orders had a profound impact on the cities, bringing the church closer to the people and adapting its action to the new challenges of the period. In addition to male orders, it is also necessary to highlight the importance of female orders. Convents of nuns, such as Benedictines and Poor Clares, were fundamental in the education of girls, the preservation of manuscripts, and assistance to the poor. Many abbesses, such as Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th century, became influential figures, contributing with works of theology, music, and natural science. Monasteries and convents were also spiritual refuges. In an age of constant violence, they offered protection to travelers, assistance to the sick, and a space for prayer and study. Moreover, they functioned as mission centers. From their cloisters, monks went out to evangelize pagan regions, bringing the Christian faith to the north and east of Europe. Irish monks, for example, were fundamental in the Christianization of Scotland, England, and Germanic regions. The cultural influence of the monastic orders went beyond the religious sphere. Architecture, music, and art flourished within monasteries. Gregorian chant, for example, developed in Benedictine monasteries, shaped the medieval liturgy. Monastic buildings, with their cloisters and churches, introduced architectural styles that would later inspire the great Romanesque and Gothic cathedrals. Throughout the centuries, the monastic orders became true pillars of medieval Christendom. They formed a system that preserved classical heritage, spread Christianity, developed agricultural and scientific knowledge, and offered a model of discipline and organization that influenced the very social and political structure of the Middle Ages. Even with their excesses and problems, monasteries were the great guardians of European civilization in a time when everything seemed headed toward fragmentation. Thus, the rise and strengthening of monastic orders mark one of the most powerful aspects of the medieval Catholic Church, its ability to create communities that, by uniting prayer and work, kept alive the flame of knowledge and faith when everything around them was threatened by chaos. During the long journey of the Middle Ages, in a continent devastated by the collapse of the Roman Empire and the feudal fragmentation that followed, education found refuge almost exclusively within the walls of the Catholic Church. The ecclesiastical institution took on a fundamental role in preserving and transmitting knowledge, becoming virtually the sole guardian of written culture and the main force that kept the tradition of learning alive in the West for many centuries. Through monastic and episcopal schools and later the rise of universities, the Church built an educational structure that profoundly shaped the intellectual formation of medieval Europe, preparing the foundations for the cultural revival that would emerge in the centuries to come. In the early centuries of the Middle Ages, after the fall of Rome in the 5th century after Christ, urban life collapsed, and with it, the public and private schools maintained by the Roman state disappeared. The population turned toward rural survival, and written culture became rare. In this scenario, monasteries emerged as the only islands of knowledge. Within these religious communities, a daily routine was developed in which prayer and study went hand in hand. Reading, writing, and copying manuscripts became an essential part of monastic discipline, as it was believed that the study of the scriptures and the preservation of important texts were part of the spiritual mission. These places were transformed into living centers of education, where monks and later, a few lay people received instruction. The work of the copyist monks was decisive. For centuries they dedicated themselves to the patient and meticulous task of copying by hand sacred books and classical works of antiquity. Thanks to this dedication, texts by authors such as Aristotle, Plato, Cicero, Virgil, Galen, and many others were not lost forever. These books were stored in monastic libraries, true treasuries of knowledge, where learning was treated as something sacred. In addition to classical works, the writings of the Church Fathers and liturgical texts were also copied, ensuring uniformity in teaching and religious practice. This function, which may seem merely technical, had a tremendous impact, as it allowed an intellectual heritage to survive intact, even in an age when society seemed headed toward darkness. Over time, not only monasteries but also cathedrals became centers of education. The so-called episcopal schools, directly linked to the bishop's sees, had the primary objective of training the clergy, but eventually opened space for some lay students, especially those from noble families. In these schools, students learned basic literacy, Latin, the universal language of the church and scholarly culture, and later the disciplines known as the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. This curriculum, inherited from the Greco-Roman tradition, formed the foundation of medieval education and prepared both clergy and administrators to serve in roles of governance or teaching. As the centuries advanced, especially from the 11th century after Christ onward, a new phenomenon transformed education: the emergence of universities. The origin of these institutions is directly tied to the Church. The first universities grew out of monastic and cathedral schools, such as the University of Bologna in Italy, focused on the study of law, the University of Paris in France, renowned for theology, and Oxford and Cambridge in England. In these universities, knowledge was systematized and deepened. Scholasticism flourished there, a method of teaching that sought to reconcile faith with reason, using rigorous reasoning to explore the mysteries of theology and philosophy. Figures such as Anselm of Canterbury, Peter Abelard, and Thomas Aquinas emerged from this intellectual environment. Universities were international spaces. Professors and students came from all parts of Christendom, and Latin served as a common language. This created a community of ideas that transcended political borders, uniting Europe under a shared cultural horizon. In these institutions, not only theology was studied, law, medicine, astronomy, logic, and the arts also flourished. Although the content was shaped by Christian thought, an interest in the natural world and reason found new momentum in these places. Another essential element in the relationship between the Church and education was the production and diffusion of books. Before the invention of the printing press in the 15th century, every book was handwritten, a task performed almost exclusively by monks and clerics. This made books rare and expensive, but it also ensured careful preservation. Over time, scriptoria, the monastic rooms designated for copying texts, became places of great cultural importance. In these spaces, the written word was treated as a treasure. Medieval education, under the guidance of the Church, also had a strong moral character. It was not only about intellectual training, but also about shaping character and customs according to Christian values. Knowledge was seen as a path to draw closer to God, and therefore the reading of the scriptures was at the center of all learning. Even when classical authors were studied, they were interpreted through a Christian lens, as a way of preparing the mind to better understand revealed truth. With the strengthening of mendicant orders, such as the Franciscans and Dominicans, teaching also gained an urban dimension. These friars began teaching in cities, creating schools that offered basic education to children and young people who did not have access to monastic instruction. The presence of these orders was essential in making education, within the limits of that time, more accessible. The impact of the Church's educational work throughout the Middle Ages was enormous. Without this network of monasteries, cathedral schools, and universities, the heritage of antiquity would have been almost entirely lost. It was the Church that served as a cultural bridge between the Roman world and the Renaissance. When, in the 15th century, Europe began to rediscover science, philosophy, and art on new foundations, it was upon the foundations laid by the Church that this rebirth flourished. Thus, in the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church was not only the guardian of faith, but also the guardian of knowledge. Its educational work shaped the entire medieval culture, preserving classical tradition and preparing European society for the profound transformations that were yet to come. When the 11th century after Christ dawned on the horizon of medieval Europe, the Catholic Church had already become the most powerful institution in the West. With its unquestioned moral authority, accumulated wealth, and political influence that reached kings and emperors, it began to guide the great collective actions of Christendom. It is in this context that one of the most remarkable and controversial movements in all of medieval history arises: the Crusades. These military and religious expeditions, carried out between the 11th and 13th centuries after Christ, were called in the name of faith, but over 2 centuries they became a complex encounter of spiritual ambitions, political interests, and economic disputes, profoundly changing the cultural and social geography of the medieval world. The origin of the Crusades is linked to a series of factors. First, there was a spiritual motivation. Jerusalem, a holy city for Christians, Jews, and Muslims, had been conquered by the Arabs in the 7th century after Christ, and in the 11th century was under the control of the Seljuk Turks, who made access to the holy places difficult for Christian pilgrims. At the same time, Europe experienced population growth, and a revival of faith, which led thousands of people to seek to atone for their sins through pilgrimages. The Church saw in the idea of a holy war a way to unite all Christendom around a common spiritual goal. Furthermore, there was a political aspect. Bellicose nobles, accustomed to internal wars, could be directed toward an external cause. For many kings and knights, the crusade was also an opportunity to conquer lands and riches in the East. In 1095 after Christ, Pope Urban VI called for the First Crusade during the Council of Clermont in France. In an impassioned speech, he asked Christians to take up arms to free Jerusalem and protect the pilgrims, promising spiritual indulgences to all those who participated. This promise meant the complete forgiveness of sins for those who joined the expedition. The response was massive. Nobles, knights, peasants, and even children set off toward the east, driven by a mix of religious fervor and the hope of a better life. The First Crusade, launched in 1096, faced immense difficulties, including hunger, disease, and bloody battles. Even so, in 1099, the Crusaders managed to capture Jerusalem after a brutal siege. The taking of the city was marked by massacres and violence, leaving a deep scar on relations between Christians and Muslims. After this victory, Crusader states were established in the Middle East, such as the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, feudal territories that functioned like European colonies in eastern lands. However, maintaining these conquests proved to be a monumental challenge. In the following centuries, new crusades were called to protect and retake lost territories. In total, 8 major official crusades were organized between the 11th and 13th centuries after Christ. Each one had specific motivations, but all shared the central idea of defending the Christian faith and ensuring control of the holy places. Some crusades became particularly famous. The Third Crusade, for example, involved renowned kings such as Richard the Lionheart of England, and ended with agreements that allowed Christian pilgrims to access Jerusalem even while under Muslim control. The encounter between the Crusaders and the peoples of the Middle East had profound consequences. From a religious perspective, the goal of keeping Jerusalem under Christian control ultimately failed, but from a cultural and economic point of view, the Crusades were a turning point. They opened trade routes between East and West, allowing the exchange of goods such as spices, silk, porcelain, and new technologies. They also brought intense contact with Arab science and philosophy, which had preserved and expanded the Greek and Roman legacy, directly influencing the intellectual revival of Europe in the centuries that followed. Spiritually, the Crusades left an ambiguous legacy. For many Christians, they represented a moment of sacrifice and heroism. For others, they were a clear demonstration of how the Church could become entangled in temporal interests. The promise of indulgences, the looting, and the violence committed in the name of faith drew criticism, even within Christendom. The Fourth Crusade, in particular, was marked by a shameful episode. Instead of attacking Muslims, the Crusaders diverted their route and sacked Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire and a Christian city, in 1204. This event caused a deep schism between the Western and Eastern churches, permanently weakening relations between Catholics and Orthodox. Another important impact of the Crusades was the formation of military orders, such as the Knights Templar, the Hospitallers, and the Teutonic Order. These groups combined monastic life with military discipline, creating soldier monks who took vows of poverty and chastity, but devoted their lives to holy war. Over time, these orders amassed wealth and power, becoming autonomous forces within Christendom. The Crusades also had internal repercussions in Europe. They strengthened the papacy, as it was the Pope who authorized and called for the expeditions. In addition, they stimulated the centralization of power, as nobles who participated needed to sell or mortgage their lands to finance their journeys, which increased the influence of kings over the territories. They also introduced new habits and tastes in Europe, from food to new forms of architecture inspired by the East. However, it is impossible to speak of the Crusades without acknowledging the pain they caused. For the Muslim and Jewish populations of the East, the Crusades were seen as violent invasions. For Christians themselves, the experience made it clear how religion could be used as a justification for secular objectives. From the 13th century onward, the Crusades gradually lost strength, and by the 14th century they had virtually disappeared, with only smaller expeditions remaining without the impact of the first ones. In summary, The Crusades were a complex phenomenon. They were born out of religious fervor but involved political and economic interests. They brought destruction, but also created new cultural connections. They deeply marked the history of the Church and Europe, leaving a legacy that would continue to influence the course of Western civilization for many centuries. As the Catholic Church consolidated its spiritual and political power throughout the Middle Ages, it began to face not only external challenges from other religions and cultures, but also a growing internal threat: heresies. As Christendom expanded and became more complex, different movements began to question, reinterpret, or reject central doctrines of the Church. For an institution that understood the unity of faith as the foundation of spiritual and social order, such divergences were seen not just as religious error, but as a real danger to the stability of society itself. It is in this context that one of the most controversial and debated episodes in the history of the Church was born: the Inquisition, a set of institutions created to investigate, judge, and punish those considered heretics. The term heresy in the Middle Ages carried much more weight than it does today. Being a heretic did not just mean holding a different opinion. It meant consciously breaking with official doctrine and spreading ideas that threatened the salvation of souls and the unity of the Church. Movements such as the cathars in southern France, who preached an austere form of Christianity and rejected clerical authority, or the Waldensians, who criticized the wealth and practices of the Church, began to attract crowds. For the ecclesiastical hierarchy, these groups represented a rebellion not only against faith, but also against the social order, as they could cause divisions across entire kingdoms. Before the formal institution of the Inquisition, trials against heretics were conducted locally, usually by bishops or secular courts. However, in the early 13th century after Christ, the situation became critical. The Cathars, in particular, established a very influential community in Languedoc in southern France, and their dualist doctrine, which preached the existence of two eternal principles, one of good and one of evil, spread to such an extent that it threatened ecclesiastical power in the region. In response, Pope Innocent III called for a crusade against them, known as the Albigensian Crusade, launched in 1209. The violence of this military campaign, which devastated entire cities, showed that the force of arms alone was not enough to defeat heretical ideas. It was necessary to create a permanent instrument of investigation and correction. It was in this context that, in 1231, Pope Gregory IX officially established the Papal Inquisition. Unlike the sporadic trials of the past, this new tribunal would be continuous, specialized, and organized, with direct jurisdiction linked to the Pope. Inquisitors, largely chosen from the Dominican and Franciscan orders, were charged with traveling to regions suspected of heresy, investigating accusations, interrogating the accused, and issuing sentences. These friars were chosen because their orders were known for their theological training and dedication to combating doctrinal errors. The methods of the Inquisition varied depending on time and region, but followed a general pattern. Investigations began with a period of grace, during which a public call was made for heretics to repent voluntarily. Then came denunciations and interrogations, which often included the use of torture, especially from the 14th century onward, as a means of obtaining confessions. Trials were not arbitrary. There was a formal process with written records and witness testimonies. Sentences could range from spiritual penances, such as pilgrimages, fasts, or the wearing of special garments, to severe penalties such as life imprisonment. In the most serious cases, when the accused was considered irredeemable, he was handed over to the secular authorities for execution, usually by burning. The Church officially did not carry out executions, but delegated the penalty to civil authorities. Despite its severity, the medieval Inquisition should not be confused with the Spanish Inquisition, which only arose at the end of the 15th century and had its own characteristics. The medieval Inquisition focused mainly on internal heresies within Western Christendom, while the Spanish Inquisition would also deal with converted Jews and Muslims suspected of secretly practicing their former faiths. It is important to understand that, for the people of that time, heresy was seen as a spiritual plague that could lead an entire community to eternal damnation. Thus, measures against heretics were justified as a way of preserving faith and order, even though today, from a modern perspective, these actions are considered harsh and incompatible with freedom of conscience. In addition to combating heresy, the Inquisition also played a role in cultural control. In many regions, it was used as an instrument to monitor books, doctrines, and religious practices. With the rise of universities and the circulation of new ideas coming from the Islamic and Jewish worlds, the Church became increasingly concerned with the purity of teaching and theological thought. This led to constant vigilance over teachers and authors, even though, paradoxically, this same period was one of the most intellectually fertile. The actions of the Inquisition left deep marks on European history. In regions such as southern France, the Cathar movement was almost completely eradicated. At the same time, the institution consolidated the Church's authority over orthodoxy, clearly defining which doctrines were accepted and which were condemned. The fear of being accused of heresy came to weigh on both clergy and lay people, creating an atmosphere of constant surveillance. On the other hand, the Inquisition also helped establish methods of legal investigation that influenced in many aspects modern legal systems, especially in terms of evidence gathering and detailed record keeping. Over the centuries, the image of the Inquisition became one of the most controversial points in the history of the Church. It is undeniable that there were abuses, unjust condemnations, and episodes of extreme violence. But it is also necessary to understand this phenomenon within the medieval context. In a world where religion and politics were inseparable and where unity of faith was seen as essential for the survival of society, the Inquisition remained active in different forms and with varying intensity, until the modern age, gradually disappearing or being transformed as Europe's mentality changed. Even after its disappearance, it remained a symbol of the power the Church wielded during the Middle Ages and a reminder of the dangers of spiritual or political authority when united with coercive power. Thus, the Inquisition is a decisive chapter in the history of the Catholic Church, marked by profound contradictions. While it sought to protect faith and preserve unity, it cast shadows of fear and repression that lasted for centuries, shaping the relationship between religion, society, and freedom of thought. During the long centuries of the Middle Ages, between the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century after Christ and the flourishing of the Renaissance in the 15th century, the Catholic Church was not only the guardian of faith, but also played a central role in preserving and developing scientific knowledge. The common idea, popularized in later times, that the Middle Ages were a period of scientific darkness and irrationality imposed by the Church, does not correspond to reality when the historical facts are examined in detail. Far from being an absolute obstacle to scientific thought, the Church was, in many aspects, the only institution capable of sustaining study, organizing education, and ensuring that ancient knowledge was not permanently lost. The relationship between faith and reason in this period was complex, marked by tensions, but also by collaboration. In the centuries immediately after the fall of Rome, the Church's priority was to save whatever could still be saved from the vast cultural and intellectual heritage of antiquity. Monasteries scattered throughout Europe became centers for copying and preserving manuscripts. Copyist monks dedicated their lives to reproducing ancient texts, not only religious, but also philosophical, medical, astronomical, and mathematical. Monastic libraries preserved works by authors such as Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy, Cicero, and others. Without this silent and systematic effort, medieval Europe would have sunk into almost complete oblivion of the intellectual achievements of the past. This preservation was the starting point for all future advancement. As Christendom reorganized itself, monasteries and later schools linked to cathedrals became the only places for study and reflection. The so-called liberal arts, grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, were taught in a curriculum that regarded the study of creation as a path to understanding the Creator. The prevailing belief was that human reason, enlightened by faith, could decipher the mysteries of the universe. It was with this spirit that scholasticism was born centuries later, a rigorous method of reasoning that sought to reconcile theology with philosophy and that profoundly influenced scientific investigation. Between the 12th and 13th centuries, a crucial phenomenon transformed the relationship between the Church and knowledge. Contact with Arab and Jewish culture through the Iberian Peninsula, Sicily, and the Crusades. These peoples had preserved and expanded the Greek and Roman legacy, translating classical works, and adding their own advances in fields such as medicine, chemistry, mathematics, and astronomy. The entry of these ideas into Europe triggered an intellectual renaissance. Universities, all founded under the patronage of the Church, became vibrant centers of study. Bologna, Paris, Oxford, and other universities brought together clerics and students from all of Christendom to study these new works and debate their application. It was in this environment that remarkable figures stood out. Roger Bacon, a 13th century Franciscan friar, was a pioneer of experimental thought, advocating the importance of observation and practice as tools for the advancement of knowledge. Albertus Magnus, a Dominican, studied and commented on Aristotle's works, seeking to harmonize them with Christian doctrine, and Thomas Aquinas, perhaps the most famous of them all, elaborated a monumental synthesis between faith and reason, arguing that science and philosophy could and should work together to understand creation. These men saw no conflict between science and faith, but rather complementarity. Nature, for them, was a second revelation of God. In several areas of knowledge, the Middle Ages produced significant advances. In medicine, classical texts were translated and studied, and medical schools such as the one in Salerno became references. In astronomy, the study of the movement of celestial bodies was encouraged both for practical purposes, such as determining the liturgical calendar, and philosophical ones. In mathematics, the introduction of Arabic numerals and the concept of zero revolutionized accounting and calculation. In architecture and engineering, the construction of Gothic cathedrals, true masterpieces that required advanced knowledge of physics, geometry, and support techniques, demonstrates how science was integrated with religious practice. The Church was, therefore, the main sponsor of one of the greatest technical achievements in medieval history. It is true that in this period, theology occupied the central position of knowledge. Any scientific inquiry had to respect the limits imposed by faith and Christian morality, and it is equally true that, in some situations, new ideas were viewed with suspicion. But, contrary to the popular image of systematic repression, the rule was coexistence and dialogue, with moments of conflict being exceptions. Even emblematic cases, such as that of Galileo Galilei, occurred many centuries later, already in the modern age, in a completely different context. In the Middle Ages, on the contrary, there was an active pursuit of understanding how the world worked, because it was believed that studying creation was a way of honoring the Creator. Medieval universities also created an intellectual method that would become the foundation of modern scientific thought. The use of logic, debate, and rational proof to build knowledge began in this period. Even without the technological instruments that would come later, these scholars planted the seeds of what would become the scientific method. It was in the Middle Ages that the distinction between different branches of knowledge was established, and that knowledge began to be organized systematically. Another important aspect is that, even in a period dominated by religion, the Church encouraged practical observation and the search for concrete solutions to everyday problems. In various regions, monks created hydraulic systems, improved metallurgy, built mills, developed agriculture, and applied knowledge practically, transforming entire communities. Therefore, contrary to the simplistic idea of a dark age, the relationship between the Church and medieval science is much richer and more complex. The Church was the institution that sustained education, preserved classical heritage, created universities, and promoted research. It is clear that there were limits and tensions, and certain lines of thought were censored, but these limits did not prevent human curiosity from flourishing. Over 1,000 years, faith and reason walked together, paving the way for the scientific explosion that would later come with the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. Thus, medieval science under the tutelage of the Church should not be seen as a time of darkness, but as a fundamental link between antiquity and modernity, a period in which Europe's intellectual foundations were consolidated, often in silence, within libraries and cloisters, far from the gaze of battles and the chronicles of war. At the end of the Middle Ages, between the 14th and 15th centuries after Christ, the Catholic Church went through one of the most troubled and fragile periods in its history, a time when its spiritual authority, which had reached its peak during the previous centuries, suffered a deep blow due to internal political disputes and external pressures. This period was marked by two events that forever changed the image of the papacy. the so-called Avignon Papacy, and later, the Great Western Schism. These events showed the world that even an institution as powerful and consolidated as the Church could be shaken by internal crises, power struggles and conflicts between political ambition and spiritual mission. The so-called Avignon Papacy began in 1309 after Christ, when Pope Clement V, pressured by the King of France, transferred the seat of the papacy from Rome to the city of Avignon in southern France. The change took place in a context of intense conflicts in Rome, where the violence of local factions made life for the Roman Curia difficult, but it was also the result of the growing political influence that the French monarchy exerted over the Church. From that moment on, and for nearly 70 years, 7 consecutive popes lived and governed in Avignon instead of Rome. This phase is often remembered as a period in which the papacy was under strong French influence, losing part of its independence and being seen as excessively involved with the interests of a single European power. Avignon, however, was not just a place of exile. It became a center of luxury, culture, and extremely efficient administration. The papal palace built in the city became a symbol of power and sophistication. The Church's bureaucracy grew stronger, the system of collecting tithes and taxes was refined, and administrative centralization increased. However, this efficiency was accompanied by harsh criticism. Many Christians looked unfavorably on the Pope's absence from Rome, a city directly associated with the legacy of the apostles Peter and Paul. This distance generated a feeling of mistrust, interpreted as the Church's submission to the kings of France. In addition, the Avignon period coincided with difficult times for Europe: famine, constant wars, and, in the mid-14th century, the terrible Black Death, which decimated millions of people. In this context of crisis, the popular expectation was that the Pope should be in Rome, leading spiritually and not living in a distant palace. This criticism became increasingly strong, and little by little, a movement grew for the papal seat to return to its traditional city. Under pressure, in 1377, Pope Gregory V decided to return to Rome. However, his death the following year plunged the Church into an even more serious crisis. With the death of Gregory V, the cardinals gathered in conclave were under enormous pressure from the Roman population, who demanded the election of an Italian pope. Thus Urban VI was elected, but soon his rigid posture and unpopular reforms provoked a split among the cardinals themselves. A group declared his election invalid and elected a new pope, Clement VII, who again settled in Avignon. From this dispute was born the so-called Great Western Schism, 1378 to 1417, a chaotic period during which the Church had 2 popes, one in Rome and another in Avignon, both claiming to be the only legitimate leader of Christendom. The schism was devastating for the moral authority of the Church. Kings and princes were divided in their loyalties. Some followed the Pope in Rome, others the Pope in Avignon. This division was not only spiritual but also political, since each pope appointed bishops, managed property, and granted positions. In some regions, this duality created confusion and disputes that undermined the normal functioning of dioceses. The population, perplexed, saw 2 authorities excommunicating each other, which cast doubts on the credibility of the institution. To try to resolve this situation, councils were convened. The most important of them was the Council of Pisa in 1409, which ended up creating even more confusion. The cardinals deposed both popes and elected a third, Alexander V, but neither Rome nor Avignon accepted the decision. For a few years, Christendom had 3 simultaneous popes. Only in 1417 at the Council of Constance was this crisis finally resolved. The council deposed or accepted the resignation of all rival popes and elected Martin V, restoring the unity of the Church. The consequences of the Avignon papacy and the Great Schism were profound. The papal authority suffered a blow to its credibility, from which it would take a long time to recover. For many Christians, the image of the Pope ceased to be that of a spiritual leader distant from human disputes and became that of a figure vulnerable to political manipulation. This period also reinforced the perception that the Church needed deep internal reforms, both spiritual and administrative, a need that would become increasingly evident in the following centuries. In addition, these crises opened the way for new forms of theological and ecclesiastical thought. Many began to defend the idea that the supreme authority in the Church should not lie solely with the Pope, but also with the councils, a theory known as conciliarism. This debate about authority and the limits of papal power would leave permanent marks on the history of the Church. In summary, the Avignon papacy and the Great Western Schism represent a moment when the unity of the Church was tested to the extreme. Although the institution survived and restored its authority, popular confidence in the figure of the Pope suffered irreparable wear, preparing the ground for the great movements of criticism and reform that would arise in the following centuries. At the beginning of the 16th century after Christ, the power of the Catholic Church in the West seemed absolute. It controlled not only spiritual life, but also deeply influenced the politics, culture, and economy of Europe. However, beneath this surface of unity, deep tensions were growing, caused by abuses, corruption, and a progressive distance between the institution and the spiritual needs of the people. It was in this context that one of the most transformative events in the history of Christianity and of Europe itself arose, the Protestant Reformation. This movement not only divided the Church, but forever altered the balance of religious, political, and cultural power on the continent, giving rise to new forms of Christian faith and to centuries of conflicts and change. The situation of the Church at the end of the Middle Ages presented serious problems. The centralization of power in Rome had generated a heavy system in which ecclesiastical positions were often bought or granted as political favors. The practice of simony, the buying of church positions and benefits, nepotism, and the immorality of some clerics created a scenario of scandals and discredit. Furthermore, there was a practice increasingly criticized, the selling of indulgences. Originally conceived as acts of penance or forgiveness linked to sincere repentance, indulgences came to be commercialized as if they were a kind of guarantee to reduce time in purgatory. This distortion reached its peak at the beginning of the 16th century, when fundraising campaigns, such as the one for the construction of the new St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, resorted to the massive sale of indulgences to raise money. In this environment emerged the figure of Martin Luther, an Augustinian monk and professor of theology at the University of Wittenberg in Germany. Deeply concerned about the salvation of the soul and distressed by the idea that human works could replace true faith, Luther found in the reading of the Scriptures, especially in the letter of Paul to the Romans, the conviction that salvation is a free gift of divine grace, received by faith, and not something earned through merits or rituals. On October 31st, 1517, Luther posted on the door of the castle church in Wittenberg a document that would become famous, the 95 Theses. In this text, he criticized the sale of indulgences and called the church back to the foundations of the faith. The impact was immediate. Thanks to the recent invention of the printing press, Luther's theses quickly spread throughout Europe. The debate, which at first seemed to be a local issue, took on continental proportions. The reaction from Rome was harsh. Luther was called to recant, but he refused. In 1521, at the Diet of Worms, he was excommunicated and declared an outlaw by Emperor Charles V. Protected by German princes who sympathized with his ideas, Luther translated the Bible into German, giving the people direct access to the Scriptures, which until then had been read almost exclusively in Latin. The movement started by Luther quickly spread and inspired other figures to promote similar reforms in different parts of Europe. In Switzerland, Ulrich Zwingli led a parallel movement in Zurich, while John Calvin in Geneva elaborated a rigorous theology based on the absolute sovereignty of God and predestination. In England, for both political and religious reasons, King Henry VIII broke with Rome and founded the Anglican Church. These new currents of Christianity became known collectively as Protestants because they protested against the practices and doctrines of the Catholic Church. The Protestant Reformation was not only a religious movement, it also had profound social, political, and cultural consequences. The authority of the Pope and of the Roman Church was shaken, and the idea that each individual could interpret the Scriptures opened space for a new relationship with faith. In addition, the Reformation encouraged the creation of schools and universities dedicated to the study of the Bible, increasing literacy and disseminating an ethic of discipline and work that would shape the culture of several countries. However, this transformation came with violence. Religious wars swept across Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries, resulting in massacres and divisions that profoundly marked the continent's history. At the same time, the Catholic Church reacted strongly through the so-called Counter-Reformation, which sought to correct internal abuses and reaffirm Catholic doctrine, a movement that will be described in another section. Among the central principles raised by the Reformation were ideas such as sola fide, faith alone saves, sola scriptura, scripture as the only authority, the universal priesthood of believers, the idea that every Christian has direct access to God without the need for intermediaries, and the rejection of practices not founded on the scriptures. These ideas completely redefined the way many Christians would live their faith. The changes brought by the Reformation were so profound that their effects are still visible today. New Christian denominations were born, such as Lutherans, Calvinists, Presbyterians, Anglicans, and Baptists. Religious plurality became a characteristic of the West, bringing freedom of conscience, but also challenges to Christian unity. In summary, the Protestant Reformation was a watershed in the history of the Church and Europe. More than a rebellion against abuses, it was a cry for spiritual renewal and a rediscovery of the transformative power of the Scriptures. At the same time, it revealed that when a religious institution distances itself from its spiritual mission and allows itself to be dominated by politics and corruption, it becomes vulnerable to ruptures that change the course of history forever. After the seismic impact caused by the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century after Christ, the Catholic Church found itself facing an unprecedented threat: the loss of its spiritual unity in the West, the fragmentation of Christendom, and the emergence of new centers of religious power that questioned not only its practices but also its very authority. The Church's response to this profound crisis became known as the Counter-Reformation, or Catholic Reformation, a broad and long-lasting movement aimed at reforming the institution itself, reaffirming Catholic doctrine in the face of Protestantism, and regaining ground in spiritual and cultural terms. More than a mere defensive effort, the Counter-Reformation became an internal renewal that reorganized the Church and shaped modern Catholicism. The central focus of the Counter-Reformation was the Council of Trent, held between 1545 and 1563. Convened by Pope Paul III, this ecumenical council aimed to respond to Protestant criticisms, restore discipline, and strengthen doctrine. For nearly 20 years of meetings, cardinals, bishops, and theologians debated crucial issues such as justification by faith and works, the authority of Scripture and tradition, the nature of the sacraments, the organization of the clergy, and the need to correct internal abuses. The decisions of the Council of Trent were profound and redirected Catholicism. It was reaffirmed that salvation comes through God's grace, but also involves human cooperation through good works, that the Bible is central, but must be interpreted in the light of tradition and the magisterium of the Church, that the 7 sacraments are essential means of grace, and that the Pope holds supreme authority over Christendom. In addition to doctrinal definitions, the Council of Trent produced a series of disciplinary reforms aimed at responding to the scandals that had fueled Protestant criticism. A rigorous theological formation for priests was established through the creation of seminaries, ensuring that future priests would receive solid education rather than superficial ordination. Corrupt practices such as the sale of church offices, simony, and the abusive exploitation of indulgences were banned, and measures were taken to improve the moral integrity and discipline of the clergy. These reforms created a new generation of leaders and religious figures who were better trained, more aware of their pastoral mission, and more committed to spiritual renewal. At the same time, the Church understood that it needed to expand its pastoral and intellectual presence. During this period, religious orders dedicated to this purpose either emerged or were consolidated, with the most influential being the Society of Jesus, founded in 1540 by Ignatius of Loyola. The Jesuits became the intellectual and missionary arm of the Counter-Reformation. Their work stood out in education, founding schools and universities throughout Europe and beyond, and in missions, bringing Catholicism to the Americas, Africa, and Asia. They also played a central role as theologians and advisors to kings and popes, using their rigorous training to defend Catholic faith against Protestant arguments. Another fundamental aspect of the Counter-Reformation was the strengthening of missions and catechesis. The Church understood that, in addition to reforming itself from within, it needed to take the Catholic faith to new territories and reaffirm Catholic identity in regions where it had been challenged. Priests and missionaries were sent to the Spanish and Portuguese colonies in the Americas, to the coasts of Africa, and to the great Asian empires, bringing not only religion, but also technical and cultural knowledge. This expansion helped transform Catholicism into a truly global religion with deep roots on all 5 continents. In the realm of culture and the arts, the Counter-Reformation also left an unmistakable mark. The Church recognized that beauty was a powerful instrument of evangelization. From this understanding emerged Baroque art, with its grand churches, dramatic paintings, and sacred music aimed at stirring emotions and inspiring devotion. Baroque became the official style of the Church, an aesthetic and sensory response to Protestant criticisms that simplified worship. This period produced some of the most impressive works of sacred art and architecture in the world, designed to immerse the faithful in a complete spiritual experience. The Counter-Reformation also created mechanisms to defend Catholic orthodoxy. The Inquisition was reorganized, and the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, a list of prohibited books, was instituted to protect the faithful from doctrines considered dangerous. Although these measures were often seen as excessively strict, they demonstrated the Church's concern for maintaining doctrinal unity in a time of great diversity of ideas. The results of the Counter-Reformation were significant. Catholicism regained ground in regions such as Poland, Hungary, and parts of Germany, and strengthened its influence in Spain, Italy, and France. At the same time, the renewed Church became more disciplined and structured, with a better educated clergy and a network of cultural and missionary institutions that would shape the face of Catholicism to this day. This movement was unable to completely stop the spread of Protestantism, but it ensured that the Church came out of the crisis more united and vigorous than before. The Counter-Reformation was therefore much more than a defensive reaction. It marked an internal rebirth of the Catholic Church, which, after recognizing its errors, sought to rediscover its spiritual mission and reaffirm its presence in a rapidly changing world. This period shaped the modern Church, gave rise to new artistic and intellectual expressions, and determined the course of Christianity in the centuries that followed, establishing a new stage in the long and complex history of the Christian faith. In the 15th and 16th centuries after Christ, Europe entered a period of profound transformation known as the Age of Great Navigations. Driven by technical advances in shipbuilding, the discovery of new trade routes, and the desire to obtain wealth and spices directly from Asia, without passing through the intermediaries of the Middle East, countries like Portugal and Spain launched themselves into the ocean on voyages that would forever change the map of the world. These voyages were not motivated only by political and economic ambitions. The Catholic Church was present from the beginning of this process, associating itself with maritime expansion as a missionary, cultural, and ideological force. Maritime expansion and Catholicism formed an inseparable partnership that shaped not only colonization, but also the way the Christian faith spread across the newly contacted continents. The backdrop for this movement was the mentality at the end of the Middle Ages and the dawn of the modern era. Christendom, newly reinvigorated by the Counter-Reformation and the consolidation of powerful monarchies, saw in the discovery of new lands an opportunity to bring the faith to peoples who had never heard of Christianity. The motto that guided many navigators and missionaries was a combination of 3 forces: faith, glory, and wealth. Thus, along with the flags of the Iberian kingdoms, crosses were also raised on beaches and newly discovered territories, sealing the pact between the Church and the Catholic monarchs. From the outset, both the Portuguese crown and the Spanish crown ensured that maritime expansion was accompanied by an intense missionary effort. Popes such as Alexander VI supported and encouraged these enterprises, issuing bulls that divided the world between the 2 Catholic powers, such as the famous bull Inter Caetera, which resulted in the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, and granted the crowns the right to conquer and evangelize new lands. This link between conquest and evangelization shaped the history of entire continents. In every fleet that left European coasts, there were chaplains and missionaries whose mission was to baptize, convert, and establish the presence of the Church in the new lands. In the Americas, after the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492, the Church played a central role in colonization. Very soon, Franciscan, Dominican, and later Jesuit missionaries arrived in the Caribbean islands, Mesoamerica, and South America. The mass baptism of indigenous peoples became a frequent practice, often accompanied by the destruction of temples and local religious symbols, which were considered pagan. At the same time, these missionaries introduced schools, catechesis, and a new social organization, creating missions or settlements where they sought to Christianize and, in many cases, protect the natives from the most brutal exploitation by the colonizers. In some instances, figures such as Bartolomé de las Casas firmly denounced the abuses committed against the natives, initiating debates on human dignity and the rights of these newly contacted peoples. In Brazil, for example, the Society of Jesus played a crucial role. From the arrival of Jesuit priests, such as Manuel da Nóbrega and José de Anchieta in the 16th century, the evangelizing project became intertwined with the very foundation of towns and cities. Jesuit missions created schools, taught the Portuguese language, and developed grammars of indigenous languages, preserving part of these cultures while seeking to integrate them into the Christian worldview. In Africa, the Church also followed Portuguese navigators. In coastal regions, missionaries attempted to establish Christian communities, but the rise of the slave trade and the dominance of commercial interests made deep evangelization difficult. In some points along the African coast, kingdoms made alliances with Portugal and accepted the presence of priests, but the penetration of Christianity into the interior of the continent would remain limited for centuries. In Asia, missionary efforts also accompanied the opening of maritime routes. When the Portuguese reached India, they established bases in Goa, where churches and schools were built. Jesuit missionaries such as Francis Xavier expanded this work in regions such as Japan and Indonesia. In some of these cultures, Christian preaching met with interest, but also resistance. Adaptation to local traditions and cultural dialogue became defining features of this missionary process in the East. The Church's participation in maritime expansion, however, was not limited to the spiritual sphere. The new trade routes and colonization also transformed the Church's economy. Large quantities of precious metals from the Americas financed religious constructions and missionary activities in Europe. At the same time, dioceses were created in overseas territories, making Catholicism a global religion present on nearly every continent. This process also brought contradictions and ethical dilemmas. While on one hand, the Church brought education, literacy, and the Christian faith to millions of people, on the other, it was closely tied to violent processes of colonization and exploitation. Many conversions were carried out under pressure or in the midst of wars. Local cultures were often destroyed or devalued, and entire peoples suffered from epidemics brought by Europeans. This ambiguous legacy remains one of the most discussed topics by scholars to this day. Despite these tensions, the global impact of maritime expansion on the Church was immense. For the first time in history, Christianity ceased to be a predominantly European religion and became truly worldwide. Priests and missionaries carried the faith to unknown lands and at the same time brought to Europe contact with new cultures, ideas, and products that would forever change life in the old continent. This movement of cultural and spiritual exchange was one of the most powerful in history. Thus, during the Age of Great Navigations, the Church was not merely a passive observer of events. It was at the very center of this process, acting as an evangelizing force, as a legitimizer of political expansion, and as an active participant in the building of a new world. During this period, Catholicism became globalized, while its actions and choices left deep marks that still echo in the collective memory of the peoples involved. Between the 16th and 18th centuries after Christ, Europe went through a period of profound change that historians call the Scientific Revolution, a movement that radically altered the way human beings viewed nature, the universe, and themselves. During this time, methods of observation, experimentation, and mathematical reasoning gave rise to new theories about the earth, the heavens, matter, and the laws of nature. And in this context, the Catholic Church, which had been the great guardian of knowledge throughout the Middle Ages, found itself challenged by some of these new ideas. The relationship between the Church and modern science was complex, marked both by emblematic conflicts, such as that of Galileo, and by intense cooperation, since many of the greatest scientists of the time were themselves deeply religious men, and in some cases clergymen. The basis of this transformation had been built in the medieval universities created under the tutelage of the Church. Over the centuries, these institutions encouraged debate and preserved the logical and rational tradition of scholasticism. When the Renaissance revived interest in antiquity and facilitated contact with Arab and Jewish cultures, the intellectual environment in Europe was prepared to question ancient models and seek more precise explanations for natural phenomena. The invention of the printing press in the 15th century made the circulation of knowledge easier, accelerating the exchange of ideas and making the works of classical and modern authors widely accessible. The beginning of the 16th century marked a turning point. In 1543, Nicholas Copernicus published his work De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, in which he proposed the heliocentric model, the idea that the Earth revolves around the Sun and not the other way around. This theory contradicted the geocentric model of Ptolemy, accepted for centuries and incorporated into the dominant theological vision, according to which the Earth occupied the center of the universe as God's privileged creation. At first, Copernicus's work did not generate an immediate rupture, but it opened the door to a new way of understanding the cosmos. In the following centuries, scientists such as Johannes Kepler and Galileo Galilei carried forward Copernicus's ideas. Kepler demonstrated through precise calculations that planets move in elliptical rather than circular orbits. Galileo, using the telescope, an instrument he himself improved, made astonishing discoveries. Mountains on the moon, moons orbiting Jupiter, phases of Venus and thousands of stars invisible to the naked eye. These observations confirmed that the universe was much vaster and more dynamic than previously believed. Galileo began to publicly defend heliocentrism, and in doing so, came into direct conflict with sectors of the Church. The Galileo case, which occurred in the early 17th century, became the most famous example of the clash between new science and tradition. In 1616, the Holy Office declared that the heliocentric theory was false and contrary to the Scriptures, and in 1633, Galileo was tried and forced to publicly recant his ideas. Placed under house arrest until the end of his life, he continued to write and develop his theories, which would eventually become the foundation of modern physics. This episode, although exceptional, deeply shaped the popular perception that the Church systematically opposed science, a myth that modern scholarship has been revising, revealing a more complex and nuanced picture. It is important to emphasize that, at the same time that Galileo's trial took place, the Church continued to be one of the greatest promoters of knowledge. Many members of the clergy were distinguished scientists. Gregor Mendel, centuries later, would be an Augustinian monk who founded modern genetics. Jesuit priest Christoph Scheiner studied sunspots. Another Jesuit, Roger Boscovich, developed advanced concepts of physics in the 18th century. Astronomical observatories, such as the one at the Roman College, were founded and directed by religious orders. In many regions, it was precisely the Jesuits who taught mathematics, astronomy, and natural sciences. Furthermore, the Church itself played a significant role in funding scientific works, building libraries, and maintaining universities. The Gregorian calendar, which we still use today, was created in 1582 under the guidance of Pope Gregory XIII, based on refined astronomical observations made by scientists linked to the Church. This project demonstrates that, even at the height of tensions with some scientists, there was practical cooperation between science and religion. Another important aspect is that the conflict between science and faith in the modern age was not absolute, but rather a localized problem centered on the interpretation of the Scriptures. Many theologians and scientists sought to harmonize the new discoveries with the Christian faith, affirming that the Bible taught spiritual truths while nature revealed physical truths. The fiercest opposition came from sectors that feared that cosmological changes would undermine the Church's authority and confuse the faithful. This fear was not unfounded. The heliocentric view, followed by the works of Isaac Newton in the 17th century, profoundly altered the way humans viewed the place of humanity in the universe. In the 18th century, with the Enlightenment, the relationship between science and the Church became even more tense. Philosophers and scientists began to value reason above tradition and religious authority, which led to new clashes. However, even in this context, Catholic institutions continued to play a central role in the production and transmission of knowledge. In summary, the relationship between the Catholic Church and modern science was marked by moments of conflict, but also by ongoing collaboration. Galileo's trial became a lasting symbol of these tensions, but it is only one part of a much larger story in which the Church was both a guardian and a promoter of knowledge. Without its earlier actions in preserving manuscripts and creating universities, the scientific revolution would hardly have found such fertile ground to flourish. This complex relationship shows that faith and reason, far from being natural enemies, walked together for centuries, influencing each other, even when in certain episodes they came into conflict. From the late 17th century until the 19th century after Christ, Europe, and soon much of the Western world, went through a period of unprecedented political, social, and cultural transformations known as the Age of Revolutions. This historical cycle encompassed the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, the liberal revolutions of the 19th century, and the gradual rise of secularization as a dominant force. In this context, the Catholic Church, which for centuries had been the primary spiritual and cultural authority of the West, found itself confronted by new values, the centrality of reason, science as the ultimate criterion of truth, individual liberty, and the defense of a secular state. It was an era of confrontation between the traditional world shaped by the Church and the rise of a modernity that sought to build itself without it. The Enlightenment, which flourished from the late 17th century onward, was the first great intellectual challenge. Philosophers such as Voltaire, Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Diderot advocated the supremacy of reason over faith and the need to question every form of established authority. Although not all of them were atheists, the vast majority were critical of the Church's power and its alliance with absolute monarchies. These thinkers viewed organized religion as an obstacle to human progress and preached a morality based on reason and experience rather than divine commandments. This intellectual movement produced a profound shift in the European mindset, the idea that religion should no longer control all spheres of public life. With the spread of these ideas, the relationship between the Church and science became even more strained. The development of physics, chemistry, biology, and natural philosophy in the 18th century strengthened the belief in humanity's ability to explain the world without recourse to divine revelation. At the same time, the Church continued to try to preserve a balance between faith and reason, keeping universities and academies active, but began to lose its monopoly over knowledge. During this period, the modern concept of religious freedom began to emerge, in direct opposition to the medieval idea of a single united Christendom. This intellectual backdrop set the stage for one of the greatest political and social ruptures in history, the French Revolution of 1789. France, until then, a profoundly Catholic country whose monarchy was known as the eldest daughter of the Church, quickly became the stage of an open conflict between the new republican ideal and the Catholic Church. The revolution introduced the idea that power no longer came from God or from the divine right of kings, but from the will of the people. The clergy, who possessed enormous privileges, including vast landholdings and exemption from taxes, were seen as part of an unjust system that needed to be overthrown. In 1790, the National Assembly decreed the civil constitution of the clergy, a document that placed the Church in France under the control of the state. Bishops and priests became public employees, chosen and paid by the government, and no longer by the Pope. Many refused to accept these measures, and from that moment, a deep division began between the oath-taking clergy and the non-jurors loyal to Rome. Amid the revolutionary fervor, churches were looted, images destroyed, and ecclesiastical property confiscated to fund the new institutions of the Republic. The peak of hostility came during the Reign of Terror, 1793-1794, when many priests were persecuted, deported, and executed, and Catholic worship itself was temporarily replaced by civic cults, such as the cult of reason and the cult of the Supreme Being. After the Revolution, Napoleon Bonaparte recognized the need to reconcile with the Church to stabilize France. In 1801, he signed a concordat with Pope Pius VII, restoring part of the Church's influence, but maintaining the separation of powers. Catholicism was once again permitted, but without regaining its official status as the state religion. This new configuration set an important precedent for modernity, the coexistence of state and church, each with its own spheres of authority. The consequences of the French Revolution reverberated throughout Europe. Other countries began to question the church's privileged position and to seek more secular models of government. The 19th century saw the emergence of secularization laws in many places, removing the church's exclusive control over areas such as education, civil records, and social assistance. At the same time, the wave of liberal revolutions spread the ideals of freedom of conscience and religious pluralism, gradually reducing Catholic hegemony in the public sphere. For the Church, this period was a long trial. It lost much of its political privileges, its influence over kings, and its role as the undisputed center of knowledge. But in response to this new reality, it also began to reorganize itself. In the 19th century, religious congregations emerged dedicated to education and charity, particularly to serve the poor populations suffering from the effects of industrialization. The Church became closer to the masses, attempting to recover its pastoral role in an increasingly secular world. At the same time, the Holy See reinforced its doctrinal position. Documents such as the encyclical Quanta Cura and the Syllabus Errorum by Pius IX condemned the errors of liberalism and rationalism. In 1869-1870, the First Vatican Council proclaimed the dogma of papal infallibility in matters of faith and morals, strengthening the Pope's spiritual authority at a time when his political power was declining, particularly after the loss of the Papal States and the unification of Italy in 1870. Thus, the Age of Revolutions marked the definitive transition between medieval Christendom and modern society. For the Catholic Church, it represented both a trauma and a turning point. The institution ceased to be the absolute holder of political and cultural power and was forced to learn how to act in a pluralistic world where its mission would be more spiritual than institutional. The 19th century after Christ was one of the most challenging periods for the Catholic Church since its foundation. After the devastating loss of influence that followed the French Revolution and the spread of liberal and secular ideas throughout Europe, the Church was forced to redefine its position in the modern world. During this time, as it lost temporal power and territories, it sought to strengthen itself spiritually, reorganize administratively, and respond to the new issues brought about by the Industrial Revolution and the profound social changes that were reshaping the fabric of Europe. It is in this context that popes such as Pius IX and Leo XIII became central figures, guiding the Church along a path of resistance, adaptation, and, at the same time, renewal. When Giovanni Maria Mastai Ferretti was elected Pope in 1846, taking the name Pius IX, the world was already in turmoil. The ideas of political liberalism, the winds of nationalism, and the struggle for territorial unification swept across Europe. Pius IX began his pontificate with a conciliatory attitude and openness to reforms, which generated great hopes. However, in 1848, a year marked by revolutions across the continent, the Pope was forced to flee Rome in the face of an uprising that proclaimed a republic and sought to drastically limit papal power. This episode marked a turning point. Upon returning to Rome under the protection of French troops, Pius IX abandoned his liberal stance and adopted a conservative and uncompromising position against the advance of secularism. During the pontificate of Pius IX, the Church definitively lost the Papal States, a territory that had guaranteed the Pope political power and material autonomy for over 1,000 years. In 1870, with the unification of Italy, Rome was annexed to the new Italian state, leaving the Pope isolated within the Vatican, without an army and without territorial sovereignty. This moment, known as the Roman Question, radically changed the relationship between the Church and modern governments. From a political power, the papacy began to concentrate exclusively on its spiritual authority. Despite these losses, Pius IX strengthened the doctrinal authority of the Pope. In 1869, he convened the First Vatican Council, which, among other decisions, proclaimed the dogma of papal infallibility, establishing that the Pope, when speaking ex cathedra on matters of faith and morals, is preserved from error by the Holy Spirit. This dogma was meant to reinforce the spiritual leadership of the Pope in a world where temporal powers were increasingly hostile to him. Furthermore, Pius IX became known for publishing the Syllabus Errorum, a list of 80 modern propositions that the Church rejected, including secularism, rationalism, and the separation between church and state. As the 19th century advanced, a new issue began to deeply concern the Church: the social consequences of the Industrial Revolution. Cities grew rapidly, factories spread throughout Europe, and millions of workers lived in conditions of exploitation, poverty, and human degradation. In this scenario, the Church saw itself called to provide a pastoral and doctrinal response to the social and economic issues of modernity. This response would gain strength under the pontificate of Leo XIII. Leo XIII, elected in 1878, brought a new spirit to the Church. Without abandoning the defense of the Catholic faith against the advance of secularism, he recognized that a broader dialogue with the modern world was necessary, and above all, concrete action in the face of social issues. In 1891, he published the encyclical Rerum Novarum, a historic document that inaugurated the Church's social doctrine. In this letter, the Pope denounced the injustices suffered by workers, criticized both socialism for denying freedom and private property, and unbridled capitalism for exploiting the poorest. He defended workers' rights to fair wages, humane working hours, decent conditions, and the formation of unions, affirming that social justice is part of the Christian mission. This encyclical had an immense impact, establishing principles that would guide the Church's action in the modern world: the dignity of human labor, solidarity among social classes, and the pursuit of a balance between capital and labor. With this, the Church positioned itself as a mediator in a world divided between opposing ideologies, offering a path based on the values of the gospel. Leo XIII also invested in the promotion of culture and science. He encouraged biblical studies, supported the creation of Catholic universities, and promoted a greater rapprochement between faith and reason. During his pontificate, the Vatican opened the secret archives to scholars and sought to take a more active role in European intellectual life. His more diplomatic and open stance helped the Church overcome part of the isolation inherited from the previous period. The 19th century, therefore, was a time of great losses and great transformations for the Catholic Church. The loss of temporal power forced it to rediscover its essentially spiritual vocation. The advance of modern ideas and revolutions forced it to reposition itself in relation to the world, and the emergence of the social question brought forth a new commitment to the poor and marginalized, a commitment that would largely define the Church's action in the 20th century. Thus, under Pius IX and Leo XIII, the Church experienced both the trauma of secularization and the opportunity to renew its mission. It became more aware of its spiritual and moral role in the world, less tied to direct political interests, and more focused on the human, social, and ethical challenges of an era of accelerated transformation. The 20th century after Christ was one of the most turbulent and complex in human history, marked by unprecedented scientific and technological advances, the consolidation of modern ideologies, and 2 world wars that devastated entire populations. In this scenario of tragedies and profound changes, the Catholic Church once again had to reposition itself. It faced totalitarian regimes, redefined its role in the social and political spheres, rebuilt its diplomatic influence with the creation of the State of Vatican City, and above all, carried out one of the greatest internal transformations in its recent history, the Second Vatican Council. Throughout the century, the Church ceased to be seen as an isolated medieval institution and became an active voice in dialogue with the modern world. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Church was still reaping the fruits of the diplomatic efforts of Leo XIII, who had prepared the way for a broader openness to the world. With Pius VI's 1903-1914, there was a strong fight against theological modernism and a defense of traditional catechism and liturgy, while concern grew over secularization and the advance of political ideas that excluded religion from the public sphere. However, the First World War, 1914-1918, brutally revealed the collapse of the project of a united Christian Europe. Faced with millions of deaths and a destroyed continent, the Church, under the pontificate of Benedict XV, tried to remain neutral and offered itself as a mediator for peace, although its proposals were ignored by the warring governments. A fundamental milestone in the Church's history occurred in 1929, during the pontificate of Pius VII, with the signing of the Lateran Pacts between the Holy See and Benito Mussolini's Italian government. These agreements officially created the State of Vatican City, an independent territory of 44 hectares, guaranteeing the Pope full sovereignty and ensuring the freedom and spiritual autonomy of the papacy. With this treaty, the so-called Roman question, open since 1870 when Rome was incorporated into Italy, was finally resolved. From then on, the Pope acted as a spiritual leader and also as the head of a state recognized internationally. During the period between the two world wars, the Church had to deal with authoritarian and totalitarian regimes. Pius XVII and Pius XV sought to protect the rights of the Church and the faithful in countries under communist, fascist, and Nazi dictatorships, denouncing persecutions and negotiating concordats to maintain some Catholic presence in these regions. This period is especially delicate in historical memory because of the Church's role during the Second World War, 1939 to 1945. Pius V, who was Pope during the conflict, chose a policy of quiet diplomacy, trying to act behind the scenes to save lives, especially those of Jews persecuted by the Nazi regime. Although criticized later for his public silence, modern research shows that the Holy See supported secret networks that helped thousands of people escape persecution. The end of the war brought new changes. The advance of communism in Eastern Europe created a long period of tension between the Church and atheist regimes that dominated the region, giving rise to an underground church that remained faithful to Rome even under severe persecution. At the same time, in the West, the Church had to face the challenges of rapid urban growth, industrialization, cultural transformations, and growing religious plurality. Amid this context, a transformative event profoundly marked the history of Catholicism. The Second Vatican Council, convened by Pope John XXIII in 1962 and concluded in 1965 under the pontificate of Paul VI. This ecumenical council was one of the largest gatherings in the Church's history, bringing together more than 2,000 bishops from around the world to discuss the institution's direction in the contemporary world. John XXIII's objective was not to condemn errors or formulate new doctrines, but to promote an aggiornamento, an updating of the Church to engage in dialogue with modernity. The Second Vatican Council brought profound changes. In liturgical terms, it authorized Mass to be celebrated in local languages instead of Latin, bringing people closer to the liturgy. It encouraged greater lay participation in the life of the Church and recognized the central role of personal conscience in the search for God. Theologically, it reinforced the idea of the Church as the people of God, decentralizing the exclusive emphasis on hierarchy. In the ecumenical field, it promoted dialogue with other Christian denominations and even with other religions, opening an unprecedented path of rapprochement with Jews, Muslims, and Eastern traditions. Documents such as Lumen Gentium, Gaudium et Spes, and Nostra Aetate reformulated the Church's discourse about its mission in the world. After the Council, the Church went through a period of adaptation. Paul VI faced turbulent years with rapid social changes, the sexual revolution, political protests, and a world polarized by ideology. In 1978, the papacy of John Paul II gave new energy to the Church. Polish and from a country dominated by communism, he became a global figure, traveling the world on apostolic visits and playing a fundamental role in the fall of communist regimes in Eastern Europe. His charismatic message, combined with a firm stance on doctrinal issues, helped restore the prestige of the papacy on the international stage. The Church of the 20th century faced a permanent dilemma: how to remain faithful to its 2,000-year-old tradition and at the same time speak to a constantly changing world. If at the beginning of the century it seemed isolated, by the end, especially after the Second Vatican Council and the pontificate of John Paul II, it had become a globalized institution, present on all continents, increasingly aware of the cultural diversity of humanity and the ethical demands of a new time. Thus, the 20th century was for the Catholic Church a period of great trials, but also of renewal and profound openness to dialogue. From the ruins of wars to globalization, from authoritarianism to democracy, the Church managed, with greater or lesser difficulty, to adapt and continue its mission in a world that was no longer that of medieval Christendom, but a planetary, plural, and constantly changing scenario. The 21st century after Christ has brought to the Catholic Church a completely new panorama, marked by global challenges that go far beyond religious and territorial boundaries. Unlike previous eras, when the Church saw itself as the center of Western civilization, it now acts in a plural, interconnected, and in many places secularized world. The Catholic faith remains one of the greatest spiritual forces on the planet, with more than 1 billion faithful spread across all continents, but the nature of its mission and the obstacles it faces have changed profoundly. The themes that dominate the 21st century are dialogue with other cultures and religions, the consequences of technological progress and globalization, the ethical tensions of the modern world, the crisis of credibility due to internal scandals, and an increasing search for a Christianity closer to ordinary people. At the beginning of the new century, the pontificate of John Paul II continued to play a decisive role. He became a global symbol of resistance to oppression and the defense of human dignity, leaving a legacy of closeness to young people and expansion of inter-religious relations. After his death in 2005, German Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger assumed the papacy under the name Benedict XVI. A brilliant theologian, Benedict XVI sought to reaffirm the doctrinal foundations of the Catholic faith in the face of rapid cultural changes, insisting on the value of tradition and the importance of faith as a response to contemporary relativism. However, his pontificate was also marked by profound difficulties, especially due to the worsening of reports of sexual abuse committed by members of the clergy in several countries and the challenge of dealing with the loss of trust in many parts of the Western world. The resignation of Benedict XVI in 2013, something extremely rare in the history of the papacy, opened the way for a new moment. The conclave elected Jorge Mario Bergoglio, Archbishop of Buenos Aires, as the first pope from Latin America. Taking the name Francis, he brought a pastoral style that quickly marked a change in tone in the Church. Francis placed emphasis on dialogue, simplicity, mercy and inclusion. His pontificate sought to restore the image of a church close to the poor, open to the peripheries of the world, and more interested in caring for wounds than in judging. This approach was reflected in his frequent trips to crisis-stricken countries, meetings with refugees, visits to prisons, and symbolic gestures of closeness to marginalized people. Among the main challenges faced by the Church in the 21st century is secularization, especially in highly industrialized countries where religious practice has significantly decreased. At the same time, in regions such as Africa, Asia, and parts of Latin America, Catholicism continues to grow, showing that the Church has become increasingly global and less Eurocentric. This diversity requires constant dialogue between very different cultures and mentalities within the same institution. Another central point of the 21st century is dealing with the consequences of sexual abuse scandals committed by members of the clergy, which came to light on a large scale from the 2000s onward. Francis, continuing the measures initiated by Benedict XVI, established stricter protocols for prevention, punishment, and transparency, seeking to restore the moral credibility of the Church. Despite these efforts, these cases continue to be a painful burden and a constant challenge for the institution. Pope Francis has also brought to light an agenda strongly marked by social and environmental issues. Encyclicals such as Laudato Si, 2015, dedicated to the care of the common home, and Fratelli Tutti, 2020, on fraternity and social friendship, placed the Church at the center of ethical discussions about climate change, inequality, poverty, and migration. By emphasizing that Christian faith requires an active commitment to the real problems of the world, Francis has brought the Church closer to issues that concern all humanity, regardless of religion. In addition, interreligious dialogue has become a priority. The Catholic Church, especially under Francis, has intensified meetings with Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, and other religious leaders. These efforts aim to reduce tensions, combat intolerance, and build a path of peace in a world marked by cultural and religious conflicts. From an internal perspective, the Church also faces the challenge of adapting to a connected digital world. Social media, artificial intelligence, and new forms of communication require a closer and more transparent presence, something that has been gradually incorporated by the Holy See, including in the way it communicates its messages. Despite these challenges, The 21st century has also brought new opportunities for the Church. It remains one of the most active institutions in the field of charity and education, with hospitals, schools, and universities spread across all continents. Its influence, although different from that exercised in past centuries, is still immense in the moral and social fields. The pontificate of Francis shows that the Catholic Church has entered a phase of rediscovery of its pastoral essence, where the priority is direct encounter with people, especially the most vulnerable. Although it faces crises, internal divisions, and an increasingly plural society, the Church in the 21st century remains a living and dynamic presence, which continues to reinvent itself without losing sight of its mission to proclaim the gospel in every corner of the world. Over the last 500 years, especially after the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century after Christ, Christianity ceased to be a faith structured around a single institution in the West and diversified into multiple traditions, each with its own identity, doctrine, and forms of organization. This fragmentation, which began as a movement of protest against the Catholic Church, resulted in the formation of a complex mosaic of churches that today make up the global Christian reality. To understand Christianity in the 21st century, it is essential to analyze this process of diversification, which includes not only the growth of Protestantism and its many denominations, but also the strengthening of the Orthodox churches and the rise of independent and charismatic Christian movements that shape contemporary spirituality. In the field of Protestantism, the churches that emerged directly from the Reformation, such as the Lutheran, the Calvinist or Reformed, and the Anglican, were the first to consolidate solid structures. Lutheranism, with its emphasis on salvation by faith and on the centrality of the Scriptures, maintained a strong presence in Germany, Scandinavia, and part of Eastern Europe. Calvinism, with its theology based on the sovereignty of God and predestination, had a major influence in Switzerland, the Netherlands, Scotland, and later among Puritan communities that migrated to North America. The Anglican Church, born in England, became a tradition of its own, marked by a liturgy that preserved Catholic elements but with a theology open to reforming spirit. These three main lines gave rise to other denominations in the centuries that followed. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Protestantism expanded with the emergence of more decentralized groups, such as Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians, especially in the context of the growing British colonies in North America. With the great religious awakenings of the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly in the United States, Protestantism gained a more missionary and emotional character, seeking personal conversions and a direct relationship of the individual with God without the need for a rigid institutional mediation. This experience became the seed for the enormous plurality of denominations seen in modern Protestantism. From the early 20th century onward, a movement of spiritual renewal gave rise to Pentecostalism, which placed great emphasis on the action of the Holy Spirit and on spiritual gifts such as glossolalia, speaking in tongues, healing, and charismatic manifestations. Pentecostalism spread rapidly through Latin America, Africa, and Asia, becoming one of the most dynamic Christian forces in the world. By the second half of the 20th century, neo-Pentecostal movements emerged, incorporating modern communication and religious marketing techniques, creating churches with millions of followers worldwide and an approach more adapted to urban and globalized contexts. Meanwhile, the Orthodox churches, which since the Great Schism of 1054 had remained separated from Rome, continued to be the main expression of Christianity in regions such as Russia, Greece, the Balkans, and parts of the Middle East. With rich liturgies and a deep attachment to the traditions of the early church, the Orthodox churches maintained a synodal model of organization, that is, governed collegially by patriarchs and bishops. For centuries they suffered persecution under Ottoman rule and later under communist regimes, but they managed to preserve a very strong identity. In the 21st century, particularly with the fall of the Soviet Union, the Russian Orthodox Church regained influence, becoming a major cultural and political force in Russia and other Slavic countries. Another striking feature of contemporary Christianity is the growth of so-called independent movements or non-denominational churches, which do not follow a traditional structure like that of Catholicism or the historical Protestant churches. These communities often adopt freer forms of worship, with a strong presence of music, and a discourse focused on practical issues of daily life, attracting especially young people and those in search of a more direct and emotional experience of faith. Many of these churches use modern technologies, television and social networks as tools for evangelization and create transnational networks that cross national borders. This diversification has made Christianity in the 21st century a truly global religion, with dynamic growth centers outside of Europe. Africa, Asia, and Latin America are today the continents where Christianity is growing the fastest. However, this growth has also brought new challenges, such as the need for ecumenical dialogue between churches with such different practices and doctrines, and the urgency of combating internal rivalries in a world where religious persecution is still a reality in several regions. Finally, Christian pluralism has not erased the attempts at reconciliation. Over the last 100 years, there have been significant advances in the ecumenical movement, especially after the Second Vatican Council, which brought the Catholic Church closer to Protestants and Orthodox, creating spaces for dialogue and cooperation in social, humanitarian, and even theological areas. Meetings between popes and Orthodox patriarchs, as well as collaborations between Catholics and Protestant leaders in global causes, show that, despite historical divisions, there is a growing awareness of the need for unity in diversity. Thus, 21st century Christianity is a multifaceted reality. It was born from a common core, but throughout history has taken on distinct forms that reflect different cultures, times, and interpretations of the same message. This plurality is at once a cultural richness and a spiritual challenge, and it demonstrates that Christian faith, far from being stagnant, continues to adapt, spread, and reinvent itself in the face of a constantly changing world. Since the very beginnings of Christianity, the Catholic Church has developed a complex and ongoing relationship with political power, shaping not only the history of religion, but also the very construction of Western societies. This influence has varied across the centuries, evolving from a persecuted and marginalized community under the Roman Empire into an institution capable of crowning kings, influencing laws, arbitrating disputes between nations, and later acting as a moral force in a world marked by secularization. The political history of the Church is therefore inseparable from the political history of the West, and its impact can be traced from late antiquity all the way to the 21st century. In the first centuries, while Christianity was still a forbidden religion, the Church held no formal political authority. Its leaders were concerned only with providing spiritual guidance to the communities and surviving the persecutions of the Roman state. This reality changed dramatically in the 4th century after Christ, when Emperor Constantine, through the Edict of Milan in the year 313, legalized Christianity and initiated a process of rapprochement between the imperial power and the Church. From that moment on, the Church ceased to be persecuted and became a partner of the state. With the Edict of Thessalonica in 380, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, laying the foundations for a shared power between throne and altar that would shape the entire Middle Ages. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the year 476, the Church took on a de facto role of political leadership. While barbarian kings fought for territories, the Pope and bishops became mediators, diplomats, and figures of stability. From the 8th century onward, this influence was consolidated with the alliance between the papacy and the Frankish kings, resulting in the coronation of Charlemagne as emperor in the year 800 by Pope Leo III. This gesture not only legitimized the ruler's power, but symbolized that political authority in the West now also depended on the spiritual blessing of the Church. This alliance created the so-called Holy Roman Empire and inaugurated an era in which the Pope had the power to consecrate or challenge emperors. Throughout the Middle Ages, the Church was the main political force in Europe. The Pope acted as an arbitrator in disputes between kings, excommunicated rulers who defied Christian morality, and used interdict, suspension of masses and sacraments in a territory, as a form of political pressure. Cases such as the conflict between Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV, known as the investiture controversy, demonstrated the strength of spiritual authority over temporal authority. This period established the idea that the Pope held power superior to any ruler because he represented the voice of God on earth. With the creation of the Crusades, starting in 1095, The Church not only blessed, but organized large-scale military campaigns, mobilizing kings, nobles, and entire populations. This political power of convocation was unprecedented and demonstrated the transnational reach of the Church. At the same time, the Church held vast properties and was the largest landowner in Europe, which guaranteed it economic resources and negotiating capacity. With the arrival of the modern age and the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, this influence began to be challenged. The emergence of new Christian denominations and the alliance of Protestant princes against Rome reduced the Pope's political power in many territories. Nevertheless, the Church continued to exercise strong influence, especially in Catholic countries such as Spain, Portugal, France, and Italy. During the age of great maritime explorations and colonization, it was directly linked to European expansion, legitimizing conquests and coordinating missionary work in the newly discovered continents. The 18th century and the French Revolution drastically changed this dynamic. The advance of Enlightenment and liberal ideas questioned the union between church and state, leading to the secularization of public institutions and the end of the privileges of the clergy. From then on, the Church ceased to be a direct political power and began to focus its action in the moral and social spheres. The loss of the Papal States in 1870, with the unification of Italy, symbolized the end of the Pope's territorial political power, leaving only the sovereignty of Vatican City, created later in 1929. In the 20th century, the Church's political influence manifested itself more as a diplomatic and moral force. Popes mediated conflicts, denounced social injustices, took a stand against totalitarian regimes, and sought to maintain peace. The Holy See became a recognized state in international law, with the right to maintain diplomatic relations and to act in multilateral organizations such as the United Nations. Popes like John Paul II played decisive roles in the fight against communism in Eastern Europe, while others, like Francis, assumed a global protagonism in defending human rights, the environment, and social justice. In the 21st century, the political influence of the Church is no longer exercised through military power or direct control of territories, but rather through so-called soft power, the ability to influence hearts, minds, and global political agendas through ethical values and universal principles. The voice of the Pope continues to have an impact on heads of state and international organizations, especially on topics such as migration, poverty, climate change, wars, and peace. Thus, over the centuries, the Catholic Church has profoundly shaped the political history of the West. From the consecration of medieval kings to modern diplomatic negotiations, through crusades, councils, and reforms, the Church has played the role of mediator between temporal and spiritual power, always present as one of the most influential actors in the history of humanity. Since the earliest centuries of Christianity, the Catholic Church understood that faith could not be only an internal matter, but also a visible, audible, and intellectual expression capable of shaping human sensitivity and giving concrete form to the sacred. For this reason, over nearly 2,000 years, it not only preached the gospel, but also became one of the greatest cultural forces in history, deeply influencing art, music, philosophy, and education. This cultural power was so vast that in many moments to define Western culture was, to a large extent, to describe the heritage built under the inspiration and patronage of the Church. From late antiquity, after Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, temples and basilicas began to be built with a distinct architecture that would later give rise to unmistakable styles. In the Middle Ages, the construction of churches and cathedrals was not just an act of faith, but also a cultural and political statement. Romanesque cathedrals and later Gothic ones, such as Notre Dame de Paris, Chartres, and Reims, were built as symbols of a heaven on earth, true books of stone carved with biblical stories, saints, and scenes from daily life, so as to educate and impress even those who could not read. These buildings, with their multicolored stained glass and grandiose proportions, became centers of culture and identity for entire cities. In painting and sculpture, the Church was, for centuries, the greatest patron in history. From the painstakingly detailed illuminated manuscripts made by monastic scribes in the Middle Ages, through the frescoes of Giotto and the Renaissance works of Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and Raphael, to the Baroque compositions of Caravaggio and Bernini. Artistic production inspired by faith created some of the most iconic works of humanity. The Sistine Chapel in the Vatican is a perfect example of the encounter between spirituality and human genius, showing how art was used not only for ornamentation, but to lead the faithful to a sensory and spiritual experience. Sacred music followed the same path. The Church was responsible for the preservation and systematization of Western music. In the early Middle Ages, monks developed musical notation, making it possible for music to be written and transmitted precisely. Gregorian chant, characterized by its free melody and profound spirituality, became the basis of Christian liturgy for centuries. Later, polyphony flourished in the churches, and composers such as Palestrina, Bach, with his cantatas and masses, Mozart, with his requiem, and many others created masterpieces inspired by liturgy. Sacred music helped shape not only the artistic sensitivity of Europe, but also the very foundations of classical music as we know it today. In philosophy, the Church's contribution was equally decisive. Throughout the Middle Ages, Christian monasteries and universities were the centers where philosophical thought was preserved and developed. Christian philosophers such as Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Anselm of Canterbury, Boethius, and Duns Scotus shaped the intellectual tradition of the West, creating a dialogue between faith and reason that continues to this day. Scholasticism, born in this environment, was a rigorous method of logical reflection that sought to harmonize revelation with rational investigation, serving as a basis for philosophy and the rise of modern science. Concepts such as natural rights, the dignity of the human person, and the intrinsic value of life emerged from this Christian philosophical tradition and influenced modern law and politics. Education may be the field in which the Church has left the deepest and most lasting mark. From the medieval monasteries, where monks copied and taught texts, to the cathedral schools, the Church was the great institution responsible for preserving the cultural heritage of antiquity. In the 12th and 13th centuries, it founded the first universities in history, such as Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, institutions that remain to this day as references in the academic world. These universities were born from the desire to systematize knowledge and to train clergy, but also jurists, doctors, and philosophers. Education was seen as a service to both faith and society. In the modern and contemporary period, religious congregations such as the Jesuits, Lassallians, Benedictines, and many others spread schools across the entire world, creating high-quality educational systems that helped to teach literacy and form millions of people. It is impossible to speak of the Church's cultural impact without also mentioning its influence on literature. Texts such as Augustine's Confessions, Dante's Divine Comedy, Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, and even more recent works, such as those by Chesterton and Tolkien, are direct heirs of the Christian tradition. These works helped to create not only literary styles, but also imagined ethical and spiritual worlds that shaped the mindset of entire generations. Even in modern times, when secularization has reduced its political domain, the Church continues to be one of the largest cultural institutions on the planet. Museums, archives, and libraries maintained by the Holy See and by religious orders guard priceless treasures of human history. Institutions such as the Pontifical Academy of Sciences show that the Church continues to play an active role in global intellectual life, promoting dialogue between faith and knowledge. In summary, the Catholic Church did not limit itself to preaching doctrines. It formed artists, inspired architects, sponsored philosophers, educated children and adults, organized libraries, and built universities. It created a cultural tradition that helped define the contours of what we call Western civilization, and even today its cultural presence continues to influence art, music, literature, and education on a global scale. Since apostolic times, the essence of the Catholic Church has been associated with the mission of taking the message of the gospel to all nations. The very term Catholic, of Greek origin, means universal, and expresses the awareness that the Christian faith should not be restricted to one people or one culture, but proclaimed to every corner of the earth. Over nearly 2,000 years, this missionary dimension has shaped the religious geography of the world, determining how Christianity spread and transformed cultures, peoples, and continents. At the same time, the way these missions were carried out reflects the political, social, and spiritual changes of each era, from the preaching of the first disciples to the modern strategies of evangelization in the 21st century. In the early centuries of the Christian era, still under the Roman Empire, the Church had no political support or significant material resources, but it was driven by deep conviction. Apostles such as Paul of Tarsus, Peter, and John traveled through Mediterranean cities, bringing the Christian faith to peoples of different languages and cultures. These early missionaries faced persecution, imprisonment, and death, but they founded communities in important centers such as Antioch, Ephesus, Corinth, and Rome, laying the foundations for a religion that would quickly go beyond the borders of Palestine. When Christianity was legalized and later made official in the 4th century after Christ, this network of communities already covered practically the entire empire. With the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, the Church became the great cultural and spiritual unifying element of Europe. From that point on, it began the mission of converting the barbarian Germanic, Celtic, and Slavic peoples who had occupied the former Roman lands. Missionaries such as St. Patrick in Ireland, St. Boniface among the Germanic peoples, and the Benedictine monks throughout Western Europe played central roles in this process. The baptism of kings and tribal leaders became a powerful political and spiritual strategy. By converting the ruler, the entire community gradually adopted the new faith. The Christianization of Europe, carried out between the 5th and 10th centuries, profoundly shaped the continent. Between the 11th and 13th centuries, new religious orders such as the Franciscans and Dominicans arose to respond to the missionary needs of medieval society. While some monks dedicated themselves to a contemplative life in monasteries, others began to live in the cities, preaching and assisting the poor. This model of urban evangelization renewed Christian life and brought faith closer to the people at a time when cities were once again growing. The missionary movement reached a new level with the Age of Discovery in the 15th and 16th centuries, when Portugal and Spain began the colonization of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Along with the caravels traveled missionaries, Franciscans, Dominicans, Augustinians, and especially from 1540 onward, Jesuits. In the Americas, missionaries founded schools, built churches, and created so-called reductions, organized villages where indigenous peoples were evangelized, protected from the most brutal exploitation, and introduced to Christianity. In Brazil, figures such as Manuel da Nóbrega and José de Anchieta played an essential role in the organization of colonial society and the spread of the faith. In Asia, missionaries such as Francis Xavier took Christianity to India, Japan, and the Philippines, and in Africa, they established the first Christian communities in coastal regions. This global missionary expansion, however, was deeply linked to colonial projects and cannot be separated from the contradictions that accompanied it. Many conversions occurred in a context of cultural domination, and the missionary presence, while it preserved languages and customs in some regions, also contributed to the destruction of local religious traditions. Even so, it planted lasting seeds, creating Catholic communities on every continent. In the 19th century, a new cycle of missions began. European expansion in Africa and Asia, during the imperialist period, was accompanied by Catholic missionaries who sought to bring the faith to peoples who until then had little or no contact with Christianity. Missionary congregations emerged in several European countries with this objective. At the same time, missions appeared in the United States, Latin America, and rural areas of Europe, as part of a renewed effort to catechize and approach marginalized populations. The 20th century brought a radical transformation of the missionary spirit. After decolonization and the emergence of independent countries in Africa and Asia, the Church understood that its mission needed to respect local cultures more deeply. This shift in mentality was reinforced by the Second Vatican Council, which highlighted the importance of inculturation. The proclamation of the gospel should dialogue with the traditions and expressions of each people. From that moment on, missionaries began to work more closely with communities, learning their languages, their forms of art, and even incorporating cultural elements into the liturgy. In the 21st century, mission and evangelization have taken on new forms. Globalization, mass migration, the internet and digital communication have created a scenario in which mission is no longer just about crossing oceans, but also about reaching the existential peripheries, as Pope Francis calls them, within the very cities. Today, priests, nuns, and lay missionaries are present in hospitals, schools, slums, refugee camps, and virtual spaces, bringing messages of faith, comfort, and solidarity. Digital evangelization has become an increasingly important front, with priests, nuns, and even lay influencers using social networks, videos, and podcasts to spread the faith. Another feature of modern missions is the emphasis on witnessing through life rather than forced conversion. The Church seeks to work in areas of conflict, extreme poverty, and abandonment, showing through concrete actions the message of compassion and service that lies at the heart of Christianity. In addition, lay missionary movements such as the neo-catechumenal communities, the Focolare movement, and the Holy Popular missions take entire groups to needy regions, creating experiences of sharing and evangelization. Thus, over the centuries, the mission of the Church has expanded from Palestine to the entire planet, adapting to cultural, political, and social changes. If in the beginning the apostles crossed the Mediterranean on foot or in small boats, today the message of the gospel reaches anywhere in the world instantly through technology. But in its essence, the mission remains the same: to announce faith and hope, bringing people of different cultures and eras together around a universal message. Over almost 2,000 years, the Catholic Church, as an institution formed by human beings and constantly present at the heart of social, political, and cultural life, has inevitably been exposed to crises, scandals, and moral challenges. These episodes, at many times, have deeply wounded its credibility and compromised the image of Christianity before the world. The history of the Church cannot be told only through its spiritual triumphs or cultural influence. It is also marked by periods of corruption, abuse of power, and serious errors committed by clerics and ecclesiastical leaders. Each crisis revealed weaknesses, but also provoked internal reforms, giving rise to new cycles of purification and change. One of the first major ethical challenges faced by the Church took place in late antiquity, after the persecutions ended and Christianity was legalized. With the new status of prestige following the Edict of Milan in 313, the Church began to face the risks of closeness to political power. Bishops and priests started to hold political offices and accumulate wealth, generating tensions between the simple life preached by Christ and the privileges acquired by the Church. Even so, at that time, the main source of scandal came less from moral abuses and more from internal doctrinal disputes, heresies, and schisms. In the Middle Ages, as the Church grew in wealth and power, the problem of corruption became more visible. The practice of simony, the buying and selling of ecclesiastical positions, spread, and nepotism became a structural issue. Influential families used the Church to secure political power. Many bishops and even popes were accused of living in excessive luxury, behavior opposed to the evangelical ideal. At the same time, the Crusades, proclaimed as holy wars, left a shadow of violence and looting that stained the Christian image, especially with the sack of Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade in 1204. Another particularly controversial period was the so-called Avignon Papacy, between 1309 and 1377, when the popes moved to the south of France and came to be seen as excessively influenced by French politics. This situation generated severe criticism and culminated in the Great Western Schism, in which there were simultaneously 2 and even 3 rival popes, an institutional scandal that deeply weakened the Church's authority in the eyes of the people. It was one of the moments when spiritual authority was most compromised by internal political disputes. By the end of the Middle Ages, one of the most infamous scandals involved the sale of indulgences, a practice that promised remission of spiritual penalties in exchange for donations or payments. Although the doctrine of indulgences had a spiritual foundation, the abuse of this practice to raise funds, including for the construction of St. Peter's Basilica, caused widespread popular outrage. This moral scandal was one of the triggers of the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, which shattered Christian unity and gave rise to hundreds of new denominations. In the modern and contemporary periods, the Church faced new challenges. The Inquisition, in its various forms, became a symbol of using faith to justify coercion, and although it was originally intended to preserve orthodoxy, its methods of trial and punishment left a lasting stain on the institution's history. During the colonial period, missionaries and ecclesiastical leaders sometimes collaborated with abuses against native populations, even though many others, on the other hand, stood up to defend these same communities. The 20th century brought an even more serious challenge to the church's credibility: the cases of sexual abuse committed by members of the clergy. These accusations began to emerge timidly at the end of the century, but grew significantly from the 2000s onward, revealing a painful reality. Investigations showed that in different parts of the world, priests abused children and adolescents, and that many times the church hierarchy failed to act with rigor and transparency, prioritizing the preservation of the institution rather than justice for the victims. These scandals profoundly shook the church's image, especially in the Western world, and continue to be an enormous moral and pastoral challenge. In recent pontificates, especially under Benedict XVI and Francis, the Church began to confront this problem with greater firmness. Norms have been created to prevent, investigate, and punish these crimes, and new structures of transparency have been implemented. However, the damage caused to the victims and to the Church's credibility is immense, and the issue remains a sensitive point, requiring constant vigilance. Beyond these issues, in the 21st century, the Church faces ethical challenges related to contemporary topics such as the defense of life, amid pressures for abortion and euthanasia, debates on sexuality and gender identity, global poverty, human rights, and the environmental crisis. On all these topics, its positions are the subject of intense debates, both internally and externally, highlighting the tensions between tradition and modernity. Despite the crises, history shows that the Church has always responded to these challenges with reform processes, from the emergence of new religious orders to the convocation of ecumenical councils, such as Trent and Vatican II. Periods of decline and scandal often gave rise to movements of spiritual and moral renewal. This internal dynamic, made up of fall and purification, explains in part how the institution has managed to endure for so many centuries. Thus, scandals and crises do not erase the historical importance of the Church, but they reveal its human dimension and the permanent need for conversion. Throughout history, each mistake has also been a call for the Church to remember its essential mission: to serve and not to be served, to guide without dominating, and to live according to the principles of the gospel. From its beginnings, Christianity was born in a pluralistic world marked by encounters and clashes between different cultures and beliefs. Over nearly 2 millennia, the Catholic Church has coexisted with ancient religions, Judaism, Islam, Eastern traditions, and new spiritual expressions. In many historical periods, this coexistence was marked by conflicts and power struggles, in others, by cultural exchange and efforts toward rapprochement. In the 20th century, and especially in the 21st century, the Church recognized the vital importance of interreligious dialogue as part of its mission in an increasingly globalized and diverse world. This shift did not occur abruptly. It is the result of a long trajectory full of tensions, lessons, and reorientations. During antiquity and the Middle Ages, the predominant attitude of the Church toward other religions was to defend Christian truth as the only full revelation of God. The Church saw itself as the guardian of the path to salvation, which inevitably led to a confrontational stance toward other traditions. The expansion of Christianity throughout Europe often involved replacing pagan cults. With the emergence of Islam in the 7th century after Christ, coexistence became even more challenging. The Mediterranean turned into a space of political and religious disputes. The Crusades are a striking example of how the relationship between different religions was marked by war and the competition for sacred territories. Yet even in this context, there were moments of cultural and scientific exchange between Christians and Muslims, particularly in the Iberian Peninsula. In the period of the great maritime explorations, the Church's mission to evangelize brought Christianity into direct contact with peoples of Africa, Asia, and the Americas, whose spiritual traditions were very different. The predominant strategy at the time was conversion, often imposed, with little room for dialogue. However, some notable figures, such as the Jesuit missionary Matteo Ricci in China in the 16th century, demonstrated openness to understanding local culture and sought points of connection between Christian faith and Eastern customs. It was only starting in the 20th century, in a world already far more interconnected and plural, that the Church began to develop a more open vision of interreligious dialogue. This movement found its fullest expression in the Second Vatican Council, 1962 to 1965. Documents such as Nostra Aetate and Lumen Gentium profoundly changed the Church's relationship with other religious traditions. For the first time, the Church explicitly declared its respect for other religions, recognizing within them elements of truth and spiritual values worthy of preservation. From then on, the stance shifted from being merely confrontational to one that sought to build bridges of understanding. The Nostra Aetate document was a historical milestone. It highlighted the spiritual bond between Christians and Jews, rejected any form of anti-Semitism, and recognized the value of the world's great religious traditions, including Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism. This new mindset inaugurated a path of interreligious encounters that would intensify in the following decades. Contemporary popes have been essential to this process. St. John Paul II promoted unprecedented meetings between religious leaders. In 1986, in the city of Assisi, he gathered representatives of various world religions for a day of prayer for peace, a symbolic gesture with global impact. Benedict XVI continued the dialogue, especially with Jewish and Islamic traditions, seeking rapprochement based on mutual respect and doctrinal clarity. Pope Francis, in turn, has taken this movement to an even closer and more visible level, emphasizing the importance of universal fraternity. In 2019, he signed with the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar the document on human fraternity in Abu Dhabi, a historic call for peace, tolerance, and cooperation between Christians and Muslims. In the contemporary context, the Catholic Church sees interreligious dialogue not only as a theological matter, but as a practical necessity in a globalized world. This dialogue contributes to reducing conflicts, promoting peace, and cooperating on humanitarian issues such as the fight against poverty, migration, human trafficking, environmental protection, and human rights. In various conflict zones, priests, religious, and lay people work side by side with leaders of other religions in social projects, schools, and humanitarian aid initiatives. Despite the progress made, interreligious dialogue faces resistance. In some parts of the world, historical tensions and cultural rivalries still hinder rapprochement. There are also internal challenges. More conservative sectors within the Church fear that such dialogue could lead to religious relativism, while others consider it an inevitable path to live out the gospel in its most universal dimension. In the 21st century, interreligious dialogue is seen by the Church as part of its mission to build bridges rather than walls. It does not mean renouncing the Catholic faith or its core convictions, but rather seeking in others what is common, the defense of human dignity, the search for the sacred, and the desire for peace. The contemporary world, marked by global tensions, demands this attitude of cooperation. Thus, after centuries of conflict, the Catholic Church today is moving toward a more open relationship with other religions. This movement is one of the most significant marks of the Church in our time, as it reinvents itself and positions itself as an active agent in building peaceful coexistence among different peoples and cultures. As the world advances through the 21st century and approaches new technological, social, and cultural frontiers, the Catholic Church and all of Christianity face a set of challenges and opportunities that will shape the future of faith for centuries to come. Unlike other periods when the Church was at the center of power structures, today it acts within a context marked by globalization, the speed of information, religious pluralism, and the rapid transformation of human societies. The future of Christianity will not be defined only in Rome, but within a global landscape in which Africa, Latin America, and Asia will gain growing importance, while Europe and parts of North America grapple with the advance of secularization. One of the Church's great challenges for the future is accelerated secularization, especially in the West. Increasingly, in the most industrialized countries, people are distancing themselves from religious practice and building their lives without explicit reference to faith. This shift, combined with the growth of individualistic and self-sufficient thinking, leads to a decrease in the cultural influence of Christianity in many regions. At the same time, there is a paradox. In places once considered marginal on the religious map, such as parts of Africa and Asia, Christianity is growing rapidly. forming new dynamic communities that bring freshness and vitality to the church. Another central issue for the future is the relationship between Christianity, technology, and digital culture. The technological revolution has brought new forms of communication and new ethical questions. Artificial intelligence, biotechnology, genetic manipulation, cloning, space exploration, and climate change raise moral dilemmas that challenge traditional ethical principles. The Church, which in the past was the guardian of knowledge, must now engage with these advances to help build human responses to technical progress that is not always accompanied by moral wisdom. Social networks and digital communication also demand a new missionary presence, capable of announcing the gospel message in the virtual environment with credibility and depth. Christianity also faces the challenge of responding to global inequalities and social crises. Poverty, migration flows, wars, and climate change create a scenario in which the voice of the Church will increasingly be called upon to act as an ethical conscience, demanding policies for social justice and defending the most vulnerable. The social doctrine of the Church, born in the 19th century, will become even more important in this context. Internally, a major challenge lies in reconciling tradition and renewal. The Second Vatican Council gave new momentum to the Church's adaptation to the modern world, but many points remain under debate. The role of women, the participation of the laity, the renewal of liturgy, and a more balanced use of new cultural languages for transmitting the faith. In a world where authority is often contested, the Church will need to be increasingly capable of listening and discerning. In addition, the unity of Christianity is a theme that projects itself into the future. After centuries of divisions between Catholics, Orthodox, and Protestants, there is growing awareness that a fragmented Christianity loses strength when facing global challenges. Ecumenical movements and interfaith encounters are likely to intensify in the coming decades, leading the different traditions to work together for common causes without giving up their identities, but prioritizing their greater mission, to bear witness to the gospel. Dialogue with other religions and cultures will also be essential. In the 21st century, it is no longer possible to live in a cultural or religious bubble. Peaceful coexistence between peoples, collaboration to address global problems, and building bridges of understanding are at the heart of Christianity's mission for the future. Pope Francis, with his insistence on speaking of universal fraternity, signals that this will be a strategic focus for Christianity. Another aspect that will shape the future is the geography of Christianity. While Europe experiences a decline in religious practice, regions such as Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia show an exponential growth in the number of Christians. This shift in the center of gravity of faith will require changes in how the Church thinks and governs, incorporating cultures, languages, and ways of life that are far more diverse. Finally, the Christianity of the future will need to rediscover authentic witness as its main form of evangelization. In a world skeptical of institutions, credibility will not come from power, but from the coherence of life. Wherever there are missionaries, priests, nuns, laypeople, and Christian leaders capable of living the gospel in concrete ways, through works of justice, compassion, and mercy, there will be room for faith to flourish, even in hostile or indifferent environments. Thus, the Catholic Church and all of Christianity are moving toward a future of great challenges, but also of enormous opportunities. Throughout its history, the Church has gone through persecutions, schisms, reforms, and deep crises. Yet it has survived all these storms because of its ability to renew itself from its essential message. The future will be marked by a faith less associated with political power and more centered on its spiritual core, proclaiming the gospel, practicing charity, and tirelessly seeking a more just, fraternal, and human world. When we look at the history of humanity and trace the nearly 2,000 years from the emergence of Christianity to the present day, we realize that the Catholic Church has not been just a religious institution. It became one of the most influential pillars of Western civilization and, by extension, of the world. Its journey is intertwined with the building of empires, the formation of nations, the advancement of arts and sciences, the definition of moral and ethical values, and the cultural transformations that shaped human life over the centuries. Few institutions have endured so much time, faced so many crises, adapted to so many changes, and still continued to play a central role in the spiritual life of billions of people. The legacy of the Church begins in the silence of the early centuries, when a small group of disciples of Christ, persecuted and marginalized, proclaimed a radically new message: the dignity of every human being and universal love as a path to transformation. This message, which seemed fragile in a violent world, ended up becoming the foundation of a civilization. Over time, the Church preserved and transmitted the heritage of the ancient world, saving texts, knowledge, and traditions that would have been lost after the fall of the Roman Empire. It was in monasteries, far from political centers, that monks copied books, studied astronomy, created schools, and kept the flame of learning alive. In the Middle Ages, the Church shaped culture, organized education, built cathedrals that still impress with their grandeur and beauty, created universities, and generated a philosophical and scientific tradition that prepared the way for the Renaissance and modernity. At the same time, it exercised unprecedented political power, crowning kings, mediating conflicts, guiding crusades, and influencing the course of nations. This power at times also led to serious errors, abuses, and corruption, which left deep marks on humanity's memory. With the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, the Church faced the challenge of renewal, and so it did. It convened councils, organized missions, and founded religious orders dedicated to education and charity. During the Age of Exploration, it accompanied European expansion, bringing its faith to all continents, a movement that produced fruits of evangelization, but was also marked by contradictions and by encounters between cultures that were not always just. In modern and contemporary times, it lost temporal power, but gained a global dimension. The rise of modern science, the advance of political and social revolutions, and the strengthening of secular thought deeply challenged the Church, which had to find new paths. Today, it remains one of the largest educational, charitable, and healthcare networks in the world, active in regions where pain and poverty demand urgent responses. The 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century marked a turning point. The Church, more aware of its spiritual mission than its political position, began to value dialogue with cultures, with other religions, with science, with young people, and with the poor. The Second Vatican Council was the symbol of this openness, and the pontificates of figures like John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Francis showed that the future of Christianity is linked to its ability to listen, to learn, and to walk alongside humanity, not ahead of it as a ruler. The legacy of the Church is also expressed in the invisible marks it has left on the world. Concepts such as human dignity, organized charity, education as a right, the hospital as a place of care, the university as the free pursuit of knowledge, and the value of life as something sacred are direct fruits of the Christian vision that the Church helped consolidate. Even those who do not share the faith cannot deny that much of modern ethical thought and universal values were born under the direct influence of Christianity. However, this legacy is complex. Alongside spiritual and cultural achievements, there are also the shadows of human errors committed by those who held power in the name of faith. Scandals, abuses, and periods of intolerance are part of this history and serve as a reminder that the Church, being composed of men, must constantly reform itself. Today, as we look to the future, we see a Church that remains alive and active in a world completely different from the one in which it was born. It no longer has armies, thrones, or control over kingdoms, but it is still present in schools, hospitals, missions, social works, and in the spiritual life of millions of people who find in it a sense of hope. The current challenge is no longer to be the dominant voice of a continent, but to be a prophetic voice in a plural world, capable of pointing to paths of compassion, justice, and reconciliation. Thus, the history of the Catholic Church, with all its glories and failures, its lights and shadows, is the history of an institution that has crossed empires and revolutions, survived persecutions and wars, and, despite all challenges, continues to echo the message that gave it birth, that each person is called to something greater than themselves. Whether in the grandeur of cathedrals or in the silence of a missionary in a distant village, this legacy remains. It reminds us that amid the relentless changes of the world, there is a constant search for meaning, transcendence, and hope, that spans centuries. And at the center of this search, the Church remains as a witness to a continuous dialogue between faith and the history of humanity.